growling loud. Epic battles, endless wars, forgotten legends in the scores, ruthless clicks, unending pain in the realm of virtual rain. Warriors rise and rulers fall, streaming past the ancient walls. Glory fleeting, shadows dense, through the veil of screams immense. Salty tears where shadows roam, silent screams where far from home. Pixels bleed and stories fade, in the game where lives are played. Salty tears and shadow cry, in this place there's nowhere to hide. Cursing at the ghostly crowd, silent whispers growling loud. Salty tears and shadow cry, in this place there's nowhere to hide. Cursing at the ghostly crowd, silent whispers growling loud. Epic battles, endless wars, forgotten legends in the scores, ruthless clicks, unending pain in the realm of virtual rain. Virtual rain, in the realm of virtual rain. Warriors rise and rulers fall, streaming past the ancient walls.
Let's go. So first, I want to start by taking a look at what the Fae are. The Fae by many are considered as fairies, creatures that reside in forests, plants, trees, dirt, and even rivers. Now, have you ever heard of elementals before? Maybe? Well, they're creatures that are considered a force of nature. I think that term really captures the essence of what elementals are, and in turn, what the Fae are, because to an extent, they're both quite similar. Both of them are embodiment of nature, with a physical/spiritual presence. Let me explain what an elemental briefly is, and I'll jump right back into the Fae. It'll serve as a really good concept to build the Fae knowledge foundation, as it were, by comparing it to the elementals. Imagine a fire ago. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are some cultures out there still that align themselves to that. So just like the elementals are, where a fire could leap into human form, the fairies that inhabit nature, they are often represented as little winged creatures in our modern era. For example, Tinkerbell from Peter Pan. Now, before the hardcore cryptozoology for this representation, let me continue by saying they are often represented like that. It's not to say that this is their only representation. I'll go into the variety that live in our world around fairies and the fae. And this is often the first thing people think of when discussing fairies, and when they're first introduced to them. And before I go into the large variety of creatures that fall under the fae, and it's huge, it's absolutely massive, let's take a look at where it all started. We have to ask ourselves one key question. Is there a point of origin for the fae? So did it start in any one particular country? Not exactly. The earliest record that I could come across was actually Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which was 850 BCE, describing some fairies as dryads and nymphs that were found around the Achilles Springs, simply dancing. Yep, you heard right. That's what fairies do. They dance and have a good time. Another seriously early account of fairies, or as it were first coined, little people, was during the 13th century work of Gervase Tilbury from England. And this is where I noticed a significant branch out around the fae and how they're categorized. During the earlier period of discovery of fae, people had used previous naming conventions, and Gervase called them demons, and interestingly, the French called them Neptunes, which is different. I've never heard that before. Gervase identified fairies as no bigger than half an inch, or the size of a small finger. Can you imagine just going about your day, seeing this thumb thing rolling around your kitchen? I imagine Gervase just thinking, well, looks like I've lost my mind. Better document this in case I'm not actually insane. Now keep in mind, this is a English representation or documentation of the earliest fairies. There are fairies from all around the world, but this is the earliest account I could find. So, I know it's a bit airy-fairy, but let's get into some real details, devils in the details. So, what do we know about fairies? Well, the more common origins are Celtic, Germanic, and Greco-Roman in nature. And folklorists outline that the belief in fairies stemmed from the days prior to Christianity, in which the advent of Christianity caused a loss of credibility in fairy folk. And before this, in the 15th century, the fae folk were just considered as being good or evil. No categories. But later on, 4 key categories came around by an alchemist called Paracelsus. The 4 are air, earth, fire, and water. But they've got unique names attached to them. Well, the fae names. Air being sylphs, earth being gnomes, fire being salamanders, and water being undines. And I've never heard that term before, so it's new to me. And all the way from there through to modern day, it's actually the Victoria era that then led artists to create fairies the way that we see them now. The idea is that fairies are cute, tiny creatures with wings. You know, Tinkerbell. Now there is a lot of information out there on the origins of fae, or the fae folk stories, but there's not a lot of information that I could find about the first account, or the iconic historical documentation of the fae folk, or fairies. I'm sure there is, though, somewhere on the web, or in a journal, but it's probably not in English. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the information that I found was from Germany, or Celtic or Norse background. So a lot of the information actually has been translated for me to be able to be read. I've been quite fortunate. But I won't delve further into the history at this point, because I've kind of given you a quick crash course on that. Let's jump into the more juicy parts, as in what kinds of fae are there. Quick disclaimer, I've picked the common, semi-common, and perhaps slightly unheard of fae / fairies, so if I've missed any, let me know. Okay, strap yourself in. Let's first cover off the generic general fairy type. So this is basically a 360 perspective of what the typical general winged fairy or spirit fairy is. So the general winged fairy slash spirit fairy is actually deemed often as a legendary creature that fulfills so many roles in our society, culturally and spiritually, that us humans never notice. Also, the more nature aligned fairy or winged fairy is around flowers and trees and the earth. So they say that flowers planted or trees grown or forest expanses have their own set of unique and living fairies. So when your plant dies, those fairies are pissed. So not only do I have a dead plant on my hands, I have a spiritual being that's furious at me. In saying this, winged fairies provide protection or malice. In the story Snow White, and in particular the Brothers Grimm version in 1812, it shows how many of the fairies are invited to the birth of Snow White, providing her the very talents and skills she has in her life. Now, this is actually coined a fairy birth, with gifts bestowed to a chosen child or special children. So, in some cases, it could be the daughter of a king. It just depends on the situation. And on the other side of the coin is the malice that these fairies can bring. So, if we annoy a fairy or a spirit fairy, they can bestow curses and hexes out of fury and anger. The very curse that would kill, or in this case, put Snow White to sleep. So their magic can be pretty powerful. Let's actually have a look at some more well-known fairies. And as mentioned, the name fairies does cover a wide breadth. So there may be some in here that you might disagree with, and rightfully so. It just depends on how you categorize the fae and fairy folk, because it actually includes things like spirits, goblins, demons, elementals, the undead, and elves. So the list we have here is extensive. For obvious reasons, I've shrunk it down to what I consider the most identifiable. So believe it or not, we can start with the leprechaun, pronounced Leith Brogan or Leith Frogan. And I'm sure I'm ruining these, but you'll have to bear with me. And of course, as many of you know, it stems from Irish folklore. The leprechaun was, and still is, one of the best known male solitary fairy folk. They're mischievous and are known to playing practical jokes upon mortals. They actually dress in a homely style clothing set that looks very, very ordinary, and is often a tiny male figure with an old, withered face. He's actually often considered a shoemaker and trades favors for gold, sometimes even wishes. So leprechauns are really, really powerful. And as the saying goes, you'll always find one at the end of a rainbow. And you'll also find their pot of gold. Never touch the gold though. Most of the time it's fool's gold, and it's often used to trick us humans. So be careful around those leprechauns. Our next fairy folk is hobgoblins. So their origin is actually Welsh in nature, and the term hob actually means hearth, ergo house. And put two and two together, house goblin. Trace back all the way to 1530s, were the first major accounts where the hobgoblin was spotted. The hobgoblin is a hairy but good-natured, sensitive fairy folk. So they basically look and live in a house and essentially shouldn't be bothering humans. They can be a little bit mischievous, but all around, they're quite well mannered. You can annoy them though, and they actually do get quite angry. They are extremely temperamental and are associated with farms, and particularly dairies. They are also a relative to the brownie. Now, before I hop into the brownies, hobgoblins, the only way to annoy them significantly is to do things like smash plates, or move things around, or mess around with stuff in your house that's been kept there for years or months. Because hobgoblins love conformity and a lack of change, so everything keeping constant. As soon as you start messing things around, hobgoblins become temperamental and start being mischievous. So they'll make things go missing or hide your keys, stuff like that. Now brownies, and no, not the ones we eat. Man, I do want to have some brownies. Anyway, so brownies are described as a person of small stature, wrinkly visage, covered with short, curly brown hair, and wearing a brown mantle and hood. They work in houses for small gifts like food, but unlike hobgoblins, brownies are exclusively tied to houses and working in the kitchen. Interesting fact, there's a house on the banks of the River Tay that apparently was believed to have such a creature there, so much so that in the house there's said to be a room dedicated to the brownie called, no, go figure, the brownie room. Brownies are considered mischievous and sometimes deemed as evil spirits, which leads me to boggarts, because boggarts are brownies with a twist. Boggarts is a term used in English folklore for either a household spirit or a malevolent genius that lives in marshes, fields, forests, and the like. Other names of this group include bug, bugbear, bogey, bogeyman, boggle, etc., and causes mischief and things to disappear, milk to sour, and dogs to go lame. The boggart inhabits marshes or holes in the ground, and is often attributed to more serious evil doing, such as the abduction of children. And I'll get into that later. But boggarts have no set appearance and size. Many are described as relatively human-like in form, though usually uncouth, very ugly, and often with bestial attributes. So, does that mean exceptionally ugly people? I mean, seriously, this could just be a really awful dig at ugly people. Anyway, one such boggart, I quote, was a squat, hairy man who was as strong as a 6-year-old horse, and with arms
Oh my
almost
fucking
as long as
God.
tackle poles. Okay, I rest my case. Clearly, they are taking a dig out of ugly people. I'm just half expecting to be like, "It ain't no boggart, that's me brother Jack." Well, other accounts give a more completely beast-like form. For example, the boggart of Lungar Heed from Yorkshire was said to be a fearsome, cow-sized creature with long shaggy hair and eyes like saucers. It trailed a long chain after itself, which made a noise like the baying of hounds. The boggart of Hackensall Hall in Lancashire had the appearance of a huge horse. At least one Lancashire boggart could take the form of various animals, or indeed more fearful creatures. So these boggarts are quite powerful and apt at shapeshifting. The boggarts of Lancashire were said to have a leader, or a master called Ode Hob, who had the form of a satyr, or archetypal devil, typical horns, cloven hooves, and a tail. Boggarts, though, are always evil, and actually appear as an omen of death. And the even stranger thing is, they could actually also follow a family even if they run away to another area to avoid them. The creature will just chase right after them. It's said that they crawl into the beds and put their gross, disgusting, clammy hands on people's faces as they sleep, just to annoy them. Sometimes they pull bed sheets off or tug on people's ears. Whoa, what a pain in the ass. Aside from that, it doesn't seem so bad, but depending on what folklore you read, it seems there's a varying degree of how dangerous these boggarts are. Now, if, however, you hang a horseshoe above the door of your house and leave a pile of salt at the front of your door, it deters the boggarts. It's like boggart be gone spray. I mean, it's hard to tell as well if they're gone because most of the time they are invisible. So yeah, good luck confirming that. I mean, I guess the dead giveaway is my ears don't hurt anymore, and my face is absent of clammy hands. Looks like it's back to sleeping peacefully. And these things are by no means small or mild-mannered. No. Apparently, they've been known to trap people in marshes and bogs, hence the name, and kill people. Yeesh. There is quite a difference between pulling an ear and killing someone in a marsh. Goodness. And one more of the boggart brownie family, boggles. Now this one is interesting. They bring on a sense of dread and are completely invisible, and perform evil deeds to only murderers and liars. Okay, that's quite specific. Not that I'm complaining though, especially on the murderer part. But as we go away from the boggarts and the brownies and boggles, we venture into the fey territory of changelings. And these are rich with resources. There's plenty of information about them, so let's dig in. There are many names for the changeling in Scottish Gaelic tradition. The changeling was called Umad. In Irish folklore, it's a Siofra, and the Welsh call them Plentyn. And anyone from those countries that heard me say this and just cringed, let me know how to say it, and and I'll be ever grateful. Now, these changelings are extremely dangerous according to folklore. The fairy changeling would secretly exchange a mortal infant with that of their fairy kind. The fairy baby is called a changeling in its own right, but sometimes these stolen babies were actually returned to their families, especially when a person can expose the true nature of the changeling. So, what I mean by the fairy baby is the changeling. The changeling will adopt the shape and likeness of a child and imitate the childlike foibles and activities that you would expect your own child to do. Meanwhile, your child is in the Fey world. Now, this is extremely dangerous, but there is a way to catch them. Now, changelings have a wicked sense of humor and laugh at how strange humans can be, especially if the changeling thinks that what you're doing is ridiculously dumb. For example, if you put your hat on a shoe, the baby changeling will laugh hysterically. Or for example, you put butter on your hand and smear it on your face. The changeling might even talk directly to you and ask you why you did that, whilst laughing. And in fairness, if I saw someone just get butter, put it on their hand, and smear it on their face, I think I'd laugh hysterically as well. But it's during these hysterics that the changeling reveals itself. And when I say reveal itself, it could be as simple as getting up and leaving the room, or throwing things, or yelling and screaming in another language. It's quite robust in how they reveal themselves once they're caught. Furthermore, these fairy babies were sickly as well. So you would be able to identify that there's something odd about your child, and you would wonder why your baby is behaving just a bit off. One way to recognize them is to place them on a fire and chant. I wouldn't recommend this to any child because the only alternative is if it's not a changeling baby, it will just catch on fire. So that's kind of insane. But the alternative is if it is a changeling baby, and I think at this point you'd want it to be, it will climb up the chimney and leave. And according to some folklorists, the stolen baby, I kid you not, I quote, is apparently then living in a place of good living, music, and mirth. The danger is when the child eats the food there, or is there long enough to become part of the Fey world itself, and as a result, turns into a changeling. So that's pretty freaky. Our next Fey creature is the Fuka. Mainly a creature of Celtic folklore, considered to be bringers both of good and bad fortune. They could either help or hinder rural and marine communities. The Fuka can be dark or staunch with white fur or hair. And the creatures were also said to be shape changers, which could take the appearance of horses, goats, cats, dogs, and hares. Sometimes even satyr-like. So for those who aren't familiar with satyrs, they are part human and part goat or animal. I thought I'd just clear that up just in case. They may also take human form, which includes various parts of them being animal in nature. So just like I mentioned, similar to a satyr. In Irish folklore, it's considered a goblin. See what I mean by categories and fairies? Yeesh. It's just difficult to pinpoint where one Fey folk start and the other ends. In Irish folklore, they are definitely considered shapeshifters, and I quote, vicious pranksters. Vicious. So I'm going to lean possibly towards even deadly. Fuka can't enter human homes. So similar to vampires, I mean, I know vampires have to be invited, but Fukas can't enter homes at all. Whilst the Welsh version of Fukas, called Bukas, are notorious kidnappers who break into human homes. So I think I'd lock my doors with that knowledge in mind, especially if I was in that era. Goodness. Irish Fukas, though, love destroying crops. Apparently. They just love it. If you have any unharvested crops, and the Fuka is around on the time of the Samhain, which is harvest season at the beginning of winter, well, consider yourself rewarded with a dead cow. Yep. If you choose to cut crops that are unharvested after the Samhain, well, dead cows for everyone. Ah, what a piece of work. Goodness. Some Fae are really, really painful to live with, and the Fuka are no exception. So let's drill down into maybe some more specific Fae. Now, you hardcore cryptozoologists out there, you might be able to be like, oh yes, stories, I know this one off by heart. I know what you're going to say. It's going to be Goblin, or it's going to be Earth Spirit. No. Actually, it's called Dullahan. The Dullahan is actually kind of mainstream-ish. So what I mean by that is you probably would have seen a film about it and not known it. Dullahan refers to the headless phantom coachman who drives a black coach known as Coach Aboa or Kois Budha, sometimes drawn by headless horses. Now I draw a tenuous link between the Dullahan and the headless horsemen, but there is definitely a link there. Now in the coach there is a coffin. Tomencroft the Crocker, another folklorist, called it the death cart. Dullahan were usually accompanied by the banshee, which were wailing as if it was a funeral. Sometimes this banshee is also headless. In other traditions, the Dullahan doesn't ride in a coach, but rides a headless horse. So again, not the headless horseman, but in this case, they'd both be headless, the horse and the rider. If a person opened the door when he or she hears a coach rumbling by, that person may have a pitcher full of blood thrown onto their face. That is the mark of death. And disgusting. It seemed that the Dullahan can take off their head at will, so they have their heads on, but they can remove them. The Dullahan may even toss their head around like a gruesome ball game. Those who watch him pass may lose their eye to his whip. According to other folklorists, the cracking of the whip is in itself an omen of death. There are anecdotes of the headless phantom or person scattered throughout older Celtic literature. The best known was Curoy, a king of Munster who was involved in beheading games with three Ulster's champions in the tale of Fled Bricken from Feast of Brickroo. A similar beheading tale is also found in a Middle English poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So I thought I would include these in here just in case you wanted to find out more. But I'd never heard of the Dullahan, and I thought this creature was something particularly awesome. Our next one is the Banshee. Now I know Arkin Brother, you're going to particularly like this one. Originally in Irish literature, Banshee actually means woman of fairy mound, or just simply as fairy woman. Now ban or bean means woman. The various spelling and pronunciation of the word for fairy mound referred to the otherworldly realm, which in Irish referred to as she or sidhe. So just to be clear, the way you read this is S-I-D-H-E. So you could read it as Sidhe or Sidhe. But the way it's actually said is she, I think. Anyone from Ireland, please correct me. So that's a cool little bit of information there. The word banshee may have originated from East Munster, and there are many ways it can be spelt. In Irish Gaelic, it can be spelled banshee, so instead of S-H-E-E, it's S-H-I-E. Or even bean, she, and ben, side. But remember, the Irish language pronounces it different. So we spell it B-E-N-S-I-D-E. They would say it as bean, she. And I mention this because I think it's really interesting around the origins of the word and the creature. And you really get a feel of the culture and where it stems from by understanding this. Now going on from that, it was only later Irish and Scottish Gaelic folklore traditions that banshee came to mean a female wraith or spirit, whose screaming is a death omen for the person in the household that hears it. This banshee was tied to a person or family, sort of like an attendant fairy. She only foretells the pending death of a person. Unlike the Breton fairy woman Corrigan, the banshee does not cause a person's death with her power or curse. Now that's really interesting because before this, I actually thought banshees caused death. So when you heard it, that was what killed you. In this case, it's an omen to tell you that your death is imminent, or a family or loved one's death is imminent. That's pretty different to my own understanding of what banshees were. And as mentioned, these banshees are accompanied by the Dullahan on certain situations. And there was an account reported in 1807 that one headless banshee had frightened to death 2 sentries stationed at James Park. It's just fascinating that these actually get reported as serious crimes or as actual events that took place. To some people, I mean, even listening now, still may believe in fairies or fae folk. So it's really cool to see how far-reaching the fae folk mythos and history goes. It always amazes me. The next fae I want to cover is the Bean Nye. Bean Nye was a Scottish Gaelic name for the washer at the ford. The washer or washerwoman can be found in almost every Celtic culture. Bean Nye is just one of the different forms of the Irish banshee, a female wraith figure. In the Scottish Gaelic tradition, the washer is the harbinger of death. My goodness. According to the Scottish Gaelic tradition, the Bean Nye was a woman who died at childbirth. She was described as a woman dressed in green, but can be recognized by her webbed feet. The female figure once seen is an omen of death, but they would be found at streams or lakes washing blood-stained clothes of those who would die. So if you see a lady washing clothes at a river, just make sure they're not the ones you're wearing. Apparently, it was better for a person to see her first before she sees that person. It was possible for a person to escape his or her doom if the person was brave enough to seize her. Wow. Okay. Stand back, ladies and gentlemen, for this bombshell. If the person was brave enough to seize her breast and suck on it. Goodness. That line of text is one I thought I'd never have to read on this channel. The person was then protected because he or she would become a foster child of this female wraith. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Earlier Irish and Welsh legends of the washer at the ford only bore superficial resemblance to the Scottish Bean Nye. The earlier washerwomen in early Irish and Welsh traditions were goddesses, and Bean Nye were probably derived from these figures. So the Irish anecdote of Bean Nye would be the goddess Morgan, and the Welsh goddess Modron. In the Irish myth, Dagda meets a woman washing at the ford of the river near Glen Etin on a Samhain night. Now this woman was beautiful, and not a preface to Dagda's doom. Dagda slept with her, and she offered to aid him in the coming battle. Though the name of this woman was not given, she was most likely to be Morgan. Here, she foretold the defeat of the Fomorians. But that was not only the purpose of Morgan. Morgan represented the sovereignty of Ireland. For Ireland to enjoy its wealth and fertility, it required a king to have sex with the sovereignty goddess or lady of Ireland. For Ireland to renew its prosperity and the fertility of the land, Dagda was required to sleep with Morgan each year on Samhain night. You can search Wedded to the Land in Celtic World, and it covers all of this off. So I know there's a lot of detail in there, and it's referencing a lot of different stories, but those are some kind of more lesser known fae folk. I thought I'd just cover them off because they're actually really interesting. Okay, so enough on the fairy types for now. I might cover more of those in other episodes, but I want to just jump into how cultures or different cultures categorize and felt about fairies. Our first one is Ireland, which considers fairies in 3 distinct groups. The first one is fallen angels who do not follow Satan into hell, but choose to reside on earth. The second explains that they are the dead who are not good enough to go into heaven, but are too kind and good-natured to enter hell, and instead reside in a limbo world where they recreate their former lives, bound on the earthen plane. And the last one is fairies as children of Eve, whom she hid from God because they were dirty. As punishment, God cursed her, saying that the children she tried to hide from him would remain hidden from her, and subsequently, all mankind. Now that's really interesting. Their term for fae, derived from fate, or fates, seen as fairies and supernatural women, who directed lives of men and attended births. Fairies tied to the earth, though, are called Aes Sid, so remember what I mentioned before, it'd be she, and are fairies that are distinctly tied to the earth. What I found personally really interesting in researching this information and finding out more about Irish history and culture regarding the fairy folk is that the Irish apparently did not develop a ghost tradition until the coming of Anglo-Normans, or demonology until the imposition of Roman Catholicism. Until then, there's supernatural lore centered around fairies. And I found that really cool. I, for one, had no idea. If anyone disagrees with that, let me know. I could be on the wrong track. I could get my facts wrong, but that's what I've found in my research. So I'd love to hear what you all think. Now let's look at the Scottish folklore for fairies. Scottish folklore has the fairies divided into two distinct courts. The Seelie court, that are kind but still dangerous if provoked, and the Unseelie court, which are the very dangerous and malicious fairies. You do not want to approach them on any account. Now, while the fairies from the Seelie court enjoy playing pranks on humans, they were usually harmless, compared to the Unseelie court that enjoyed bringing harm to humans as entertainment. Something that you might not know is that Scottish fairy tales talk about trooping fairies, which are fairies who appear in groups and might form settlements. These settlements then go on to grow and increase in size or attack and conquer other settlements. In the Scottish definition, fairies are usually understood in a wider sense, as the term can also include various kinds of mythical creatures, mainly of Celtic origin. However, the term might also be used for similar beings such as dwarves or elves from Germanic folklore, which are opposed to the solitary fairies who do not live or associate with others of their kind. So like dryads and nymphs. And those two, dryads and nymphs, are a different creature set altogether, but similar to fairies, because they too inhabit the trees, the plants, the forest. Dryads normally, to my knowledge and research, inhabit trees. They can even inhabit one tree. And nymphs are often seen as elementals that inhabit rivers, lakes, ponds. They're more of a water elemental type. Now, Norse mythology call the fairy folk, oh gosh, I'm going to ruin this, Doklafar and Iljosalfa. So Old Norse for light elves and dark elves. The two different elves are as you would expect. So the first one mentioned, which is the light elves, dwell within the earth and have leathery, rough skin. And it's written that they are fairer than the sun to look at, while the latter are as dark as night, and equally dark-spirited in nature. There isn't too much on them other than the terminology and cross-referencing to elves and fairy folk, so this was difficult to locate. And the Norse also speak of Fiend or the Feenan, roughly translating to fair ones. And then it also references hill people, so just like the Irish folklore, Sidhe or she. In some accounts, it also stretches the wording to also refer to these creatures as Picts. So if some of the sharper cryptozoologist people out there, or fans out there, you may be able to stretch that was where the word pixie came from. Regarding German tales, the brother Grimm actually had some fairies deemed as undead, daemons, or demons, that walk the Fey realm that humans cannot see. And I can understand how the Brothers Grimm came to that conclusion, especially when it comes to these creatures being able to pop in and out of our plane and the way that they interact with us. I can see how they would draw that link. Now, moving on from the cultural component, I want to move on to the more common linking traits that these creatures share with each other, and whether or not you should fear them or be kind to them. So are Fae dangerous? Well, I think you can kind of guess the answer to that one. But let's have a look at the Fae attributes in general. They do have wild mood swings and can react in crazy ways to the smallest of acts, both in a positive and negative way, giving amazing rewards for small acts of kindness, while doling out an equally crazy punishment for a small offense. The Fae are heavily rule-driven, stricken to rules and taboos that can sometimes conflict with human nature, and often don't mesh with our rules and regulations. If we're talking about Scottish law, where there are two courts, the Unseelie and Seelie, it's really easy to identify which ones you want to interact with. The Seelie court can be dangerous if offended. They can be. But the primary difference between these two groups is that the Unseelie court is never, under any circumstances, favorable to humans. Ever. So should you ever encounter them, well, run. They will only harm, trick, or kill you. Now, there's no clear indicator of how to identify a Seelie from an Unseelie other than them actually telling you up front, and they often will, because they are often proud of what they represent. Aside from Scottish law, the Fae can be kind and are capable of gratitude. They readily reward any kindness done to them, no matter how small, and they can show gratitude through some amazing ways. For example, typical rewards include gifts of food or magical supplies of grain and flour that never end, constant good health and fortune, or even being saved from danger, or even death. So yeah, they possess great strength. And you can expect good fairies to be helpful and fair, to return stuff they borrow, to support true love, to enjoy music and dancing, and to keep things neat and tidy and in order. And they have a keen admiration for beauty. In saying that, if you do anything to disrupt this, that's when the fairy folk or fae folk like brownies and boggarts really play up. Fairies also don't care about human objects. I mean, not even remotely. And they seem to believe they are entitled to take whatever they need. The fairy adage is, all that's yours is mine, and all that's mine is my own. They don't just steal objects. They kidnap cows, horses, and all sorts of small beasts. So, in other words, fairies are full of double standards. And here are some definitely negative aspects to fairies. Do not steal from them. Fairies become furious if humans steal from them. They won't just be playing tricks on you if they find out that you're the person that took it. And if a prank backfires or the joke is on them, they do not take it well. Trust me, it's double standards galore with fairies. Never trust the fae. They keep to their word, but it's often twisted. So keep your wits about you. Never enter the fae world. This is a big one. If you are invited into the fae or to enter the fae plane, you will know from the haze and the mist that humans see. The fae don't see that, because they can see with clarity. The biggest caution I can give you from my own research is, do not eat there, okay? If you eat there, you will never, ever leave. Once their food touches your lips, you're their property. That's it, you're stuck in the fae plane. There have been stories though of magical items promised by the fae, where those rewards are tucked away in the plane world. Now once given to them, they put it on, whether it be a pair of boots or a jacket, and it whisks them away from our world into the fae world, never to be seen again. But there is some level of countermeasure here. Lastly on this list is carry a mirror. Whenever you enter a forest and you think there may be fae around, use the mirror to identify illusions versus reality. Some fae are illusionary and won't appear visible in the mirror, and thus cannot directly harm you. If they appear there though, and it happens to be a boggart or a changeling, definitely be careful. Hell, even just run. It is totally not worth the risk. And this concludes the 100th episode. And before I end this episode, I'll just talk about the channel and the future of the channel briefly. So for those of you that have been with me from the very beginning, the long haul, the big slug, thank you so much. Seriously, it's been an absolute pleasure narrating these, and it's only going to continue to get better. This channel goes from leaps and bounds with your support. The fact that you're listening, the fact that I have listeners here right now, is helping this channel grow, which is helping authors get their stories out there and growing the community. So a special thank you to the listeners. And I can tell people are sharing this podcast around. The numbers do not lie.
Yes! Hey! Hey! We know each other. He's a friend from work.
Hi. Didn't even hear my alert go off. Welcome in. Let me pause this. Thank you for the raid. Thank you for coming in, coming over, bringing everybody over here. We are changing up the bridge. Gonna make it a little bit bigger, a little more grand to match our giant dragon. This is something that I haven't seen in any other game. Is you can use AI to make items for in game. So that's something to be aware of when you're coming in here. Need to raid and run. I need sleep. Okay. Thank you again for the raid. I completely understand. Get it. 100%. Go get your sleep on. For those of you sticking around, this game is a lot of fun. This is Dreamworld. It is an open world MMO. It has some features that you will not find in any other game, such as what I was just talking about. Have an AI generation item in here. You can actually create your own items for in game. I created some dragons and guardians. My little started my little tree world here. And I am I'm gonna make the bridge just needs to be a little wider. Not wide enough for my old fat ass. So I decided to make it bigger. And change it up just so that it's stone on one end, stone on the other. So we're doing. Welcome in, everybody. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for chilling. Our little there. I cannot fly yet. Know how to happen. At least not yet. How to fly yet. Not quite that far. Yeah. That's what we're doing right now. That's what today. I spent a great deal of time this past week opening up the map. Where I wanted to build it. Wanted to. This is an infinite map. As far as I can tell, it has no end. Just goes forever. It's free to play right now. It is in alpha. It does have some buggy issues, like any alpha, you know, play testing. You're gonna find bugs and issues, lots of different. They're still working on it. Notice some of the stuff is very familiar looking if you play Palia, Pal World, Valheim. Any of those games, you're gonna notice a lot of this mechanics, same clothing, character styles, lot of that stuff's gonna look very, very familiar. But that's what we're doing, and we've been listening to the history of certain magical little creatures and stuff, such as the Fae, and jumping into mermaids right now. See, now we're by a river, so seemed appropriate. Welcome in. Enjoy the narration. We keep building.
Congratulations. You've just been killed by a mermaid. Welcome to the afterlife, I guess. You're probably wondering, how could I have avoided this? There's nothing more annoying than going for your daily run only to be interrupted by some random mermaid who wants to drown you. Luckily for you and myself, today's video is sponsored by Raycon, voted the #1 anti-mermaid / mythical creature wireless, somewhat familiar with mermaids by now, doubt more. I think we're all somewhat familiar with mermaids by now. Whether it's a beautiful woman with a fishtail who majestically swims through the ocean, or something far more seductive that would drown you without a second thought if you dared to venture too close.
Oh, little
Every
piggy.
region has its own stories surrounding them, and some of them are quite dark and twisted. So join me today as we take a look at mermaids and their rather messed up history. The most common description of a mermaid is that of an aquatic creature with the head and torso of a woman and the lower half of a fish, but depending where you are in the world, that can vary. One of the biggest influences in the West regarding mermaids comes from the sirens of Greek mythology, who, despite often being confused and compared with mermaids, were in fact more bird than fish. We see the sirens in two of Greek mythology's most well-known epic poems, the Argonautica and the Odyssey. In both of these they are fairly similar to modern mermaids, using their enchanting voices to lure sailors into a watery grave, which is where the term a siren's call comes from, being enticed to go somewhere or do something that we know will end poorly, something I'm sure many of us can relate to.
Little piggies
When
aren't
the
quite
Argonauts
that smart.
encountered the sirens, their musician Orpheus drowned out the siren song with his own song, and as a result only one man jumped overboard. When Odysseus and his crew encountered the sirens, he instructed his men to fill their ears with beeswax in order to nullify the singing. Odysseus himself, however, was extremely intrigued that no man had ever heard the siren's song and lived to tell the tale, and so he further instructed his crew to tie him to the mast of his ship. No matter how much he begged and pleaded with them to release him, they were to ignore him until they passed safely by the sirens. Authors after Homer believed if a man heard the siren's song and survived, the sirens would have to drown themselves in the sea. Once we get closer to the Hellenistic period, images of sirens shifted from bird women to women with a fish tail. Roman authors in particular, such as Hyginus and Ovid, heavily linked the sirens to the ocean. Ovid himself helped popularize the origin story of sirens. According to him, they were not always half woman, half bird. Originally, they were the nymphs and handmaidens to the goddess Persephone. In the versions of the story where Persephone was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld, her mother Demeter gave the handmaidens wings so they could aid in the search for her lost daughter. Hyginus, on the other hand, saw this as more of a curse. Demeter blamed the handmaidens for her daughter's disappearance, and so in anger she transformed them into the sirens. The siren song, although beautiful and alluring, also has a strong undertone of sorrow and even death, continually calling out to Persephone in the hope she may one day return. Before we move away from Greek mythology, for those wondering if there was a male equivalent, mermen did also exist. One example was a man who went by the name of Glaucus, a fisherman who discovered a magical herb that would bring fish back to life when consumed. Curious of its effects on mortals, he tried some for himself. This resulted in his legs becoming a fishtail and the overwhelming desire to live in the sea. Although he was now considered immortal, Glaucus struggled to come to terms with his newfound gift. That is until the other deities of the sea taught him its secrets and even the art of prophecy. From then on, Glaucus was known as someone who would appear to those lost at sea in order to guide them to safety. One of his most noticeable appearances is in the Argonautica, where he appears to the Argonauts and informs them of what really happened to Heracles and the other missing men, helping to stop a full-blown mutiny from the crew members who blamed Jason for the disappearance of Heracles. The most well-known example of a merman in Greek mythology was Triton, the son of Poseidon and Amphitrite. Neither of his parents are ever really described as merfolk, because they could live on both land and sea. Triton, however, is described as being half man and half fish from the day he was born, making him the stereotypical merman. For the most part, he acted as his father's messenger within the sea, which makes sense considering covering the underworld, the earth, the heavens, and the sea may have been a bit too much for Hermes to handle alone. Similar to Glaucus, he also appeared to the Argonauts to aid them in the return leg of their journey. However, there are numerous images of Triton wrestling and drowning heroes and other mortals. Heracles wrestling Triton is an image you see often in Greek pottery. The image of mermen became so heavily associated with Triton himself that they were eventually just known as Tritons or Tritoni, the musical fishmen of the ocean. Moving to the eastern parts of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, there are numerous stories to examine. Images of humans with fishtails can be traced as far back as the First Babylonian Empire. The Mesopotamian goddess Atargatis is one of the first recorded stories of mermaids in this region. She fell in love with a human shepherd who sadly drowned in a lake. Not being able to deal with the pain of being apart from each other, she threw herself in the lake in the hopes that she would also drown and reunite with her lover in the afterlife. The gods, however, would not allow her to die, and so they made the ocean her new home. They transformed her into a fish, at least her lower half. Her torso would remain that of a woman, because her beauty could not be hidden. 1001 Nights is also a great text to read if Middle Eastern ideas surrounding mermaids pique your interest. There are numerous stories that feature humans who are able to breathe and live underwater. These are described as sea people or seaborn. Now, if there's one place we can rely on for these stories to get super weird in terms of appearance, you can always count on Japan. Here you have creatures known as Ningyo, which means human fish, and I can promise you they are in no way seductive mermaids. The Ningyo are not part fish, they are mostly fish, with their head being the only part that resembles a human. They also had golden horns, a red belly, and additional eyes around their torso. Hunting and capturing these creatures required a rather large group, as they were said to be around 35 feet long, so definitely more of a mer-monster than mermaid. In Slavic folklore, there are creatures known as the Rusalka, female spirits that dwell in lakes and rivers, luring young men to their death with the sound of their voices. These are said to be the spirits of young women who died from drowning because of an unhappy marriage. This can be a suicide due to being abused and harassed, or even jilted by a lover. It can also be because they may have been murdered by said lover. An example often used would be an unwanted child, resulting in them being drowned to hide the pregnancy. The spirit is then cursed to spend their remaining time as a Rusalka seeking vengeance. Before the 19th century, the Rusalka were not always considered evil. They were associated with fertility. During the spring, they would emerge from the water and walk
Well,
around
that worked
fields.
pretty
In
good.
doing so, they transferred a portion of their own essence, which would seep into crops and allow them to be nurtured. During the 19th century, they were perceived as chaotic and unclean spirits. It was common to hear stories of young women dying by lakes and rivers, becoming Rusalka. When young men approached the riverbed, they would be mesmerized by the singing, and when they were close enough, the Rusalka would entangle them in their long, vibrant hair, wrap their feet around them, and drag them below the water. As odd as it may sound, in countries such as Poland, they preferred to tickle their victims to death as opposed to drowning them, which sounds equally as horrifying. They can also alter their appearance to suit the desires of their victim. From afar they appear as beautiful women, but when up close their hair color changes to a moldy green, and their face distorts, showing their true nature. They were not, however, always considered malevolent or evil spirits for the sake of being evil. Much like a poltergeist, if their death was in some way avenged, then their spirit would be allowed to rest. They may not be half woman, half fish, but they do share several similarities with mermaids. You have the colourful, vibrant hair, the idea of beauty, and most Rusalka had to remain partially submerged in the water, making trips to land not very common. The Rusalka was a symbol of immense beauty, but also one that was extremely feared and respected. Mermaids were also mentioned in Britain and Ireland during the medieval period. Coming across a mermaid at sea was considered a bad omen. In some cases, mermaids would foretell troublesome weather or some kind of disaster. Other times, the mermaids themselves would cause ill fortune. The Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens talks about a rather cryptic mermaid. She would tell sailors and ships at sea that they would never see land again, and other times she would lie to them and tell them that they were near the shore. Those who were not lost at sea could tell that they were nowhere near land. This just meant their vessel was fated to crash into rocks. There were also cautionary tales involving mermaids drowning people in rivers and lakes if they came too close. On rare occasions, some of these stories were more positive, such as mermaids helping those who were drowning, and even teaching them medicines and cures that were found in nature. Some other mermaids from around the world worthy of a mention include the European Melusina, the mother of water spirits native to Central Africa, and the Chinese shark people. Stories of mermaids have existed for thousands of years all over the world, and there is no shortage of them in modern fiction either. When you have stories and legends that are universally told and stand the test of time, it's normally because there is something there we can relate to or reflect upon. Something that intrigues but also still leaves an element of mystery. When it comes to mermaids, it's not hard to see why people enjoy them in stories. Their tragic past and the duality between beautiful and deadly. Above the water there is a calm, beautiful and elegant exterior, which plays on your humanity and draws you in. Below it's mysterious, cold, dark and unforgiving. A pretty accurate description of how we used to, and even sometimes today, still view the ocean. Sailing the seas thousands and even hundreds of years ago was much more perilous than it is today. Mermaids are just one of a long list of creatures created to try and explain these stories. They also serve as a reminder that appearances can be somewhat deceiving. As we mentioned earlier, today's video has been made possible by Raycon. Finding a good pair of wireless earbuds can be very expensive, but not with Raycon.
Yeah, that was
Beneath the mesmerizing ocean waves, a creature of myth and wonder captivates our imagination like no other. In the depths where sunlight delicately caresses the swirling currents, an enchanting being resides, the mermaid, an embodiment of elegance and enchantment. Throughout folklore and mythology, the mermaid emerges as a legendary figure, possessing the upper body of a human and the lower body of a fish. This exquisite half-human, half-fish hybrid has enraptured the minds of people throughout history, forever associated with mesmerizing beauty and irresistible allure. From her graceful neck adorned with cascading locks of hair to her deep, mysterious eyes that beckon with intrigue, the mermaid's upper body mirrors that of a captivating human female. As we journey downward, her upper body seamlessly merges into a fish-like tail, a magnificent creation adorned with vibrant scales reminiscent of the sea's diverse marine creatures. The tail takes on various shapes, often portrayed as long and sleek, tapering gracefully towards its end. Its textured fin splays into multiple luscious, flowing lobes, facilitating elegant swimming and navigating the ocean's depths. Yet, it's crucial to note that depictions of mermaids can vary across cultures and artistic interpretations, ensuring a captivating tapestry of diversity within this enchanting realm. While the general image we've just explored remains widely recognized, specific details may diverge depending on the source of inspiration. The origins of mermaid legends trace back to ancient times, where tales and depictions sprung forth across different cultures worldwide. One such early mythical creature resembling a mermaid is Atargatis, an Assyrian goddess. Fertility and protection flowed through her divine presence, for she was worshipped as a guardian deity of the city Hierapolis. One legend has it, Atargatis, consumed by sorrow, inadvertently took the life of a mortal shepherd whom she loved. Grief-stricken, she leaped into a lake, hoping to transform into a fish. However, her ethereal beauty hindered a complete metamorphosis, resulting in her half-woman, half-fish appearance. In Greek mythology, sirens were enchanting creatures who resided on rocky islands in the sea, known as Sirenum Scapulae. They make their first appearance in Homer's Odyssey. They are described as malevolent creatures, often associated with danger, temptation, and the perils of the sea. Known for their sweet, irresistible voices, sirens sing to hopeless passing sailors, luring them to their untimely demise. The earliest depictions of sirens described these creatures as half-woman, half-bird hybrids, with the upper body of a beautiful woman and the lower body of a bird. However, depictions of sirens would later shift during the classical era, describing them to have features more similar to that of a mermaid's. While still on the topic of the enchanting realm of Greek mythology, mermen are another captivating array of half-human, half-fish beings also residing within the sea. Mermen are the male counterparts to their mesmerizing mermaid counterparts. Among these extraordinary figures, Triton, a merman often depicted as the son of Poseidon and Amphitrite. He is known as the messenger of the sea, heralding the arrival of his father or other important sea deities. Triton is often portrayed as a half-human, half-fish creature with the upper body of a muscular man and the lower body of a fish. In appearance, Triton is usually depicted with a bearded face, often with a conch shell in his hand, which he would blow to calm or stir the waves. The sound produced by the conch shell was said to be so powerful that it could be heard across vast distances, making Triton an unmistakable presence whenever he arrived. Triton's role as a messenger involved a variety of tasks. He would deliver messages between gods and sea creatures, as well as between the sea and the land. His appearances were often accompanied by great fanfare, with the blowing of the conch shell and the emergence of powerful waves or sea creatures heralding his arrival. According to some myths, Triton was also associated with the protection of sailors and sea travelers. He would use his conch shell to guide ships safely through treacherous waters, warning of impending storms or other dangers. Sailors would often invoke his name and seek his favor before embarking on their voyages, hoping for his protection and assistance. Within African folklore, mermaid-like entities emerge as water spirits known as Mami Wata, embodying beauty, fertility, and the power of water. Mami Wata is a captivating and mythical figure often described as an African mermaid. She is revered in various regions of Africa, particularly in West, Central, and Southern Africa. Mami Wata is believed to be a powerful water spirit or deity associated with water bodies such as rivers, lakes, and oceans. Her name, which translates to Mother Water or Mistress Water in various African languages, reflects her deep connection to water and her role as a guardian of its mysteries. The legends and stories surrounding Mami Wata vary across different African cultures, but certain characteristics and motifs are commonly attributed to her. In artistic representations, Mami Wata is often depicted as a beautiful and seductive woman with long flowing hair and a fish-like tail. She may also be portrayed with other elements such as a mirror, comb, or snake. These symbols signify her allure, femininity, and connection to both the earthly and spiritual realms. Mami Wata is considered a deity of great wealth, prosperity, and fertility. She is associated with abundance, beauty, and sensuality, and is believed to bestow blessings upon her devotees. Mami Wata is also considered a healer and a bringer of good fortune. Her devotees seek her assistance in various aspects of life, including love, marriage, childbirth, and financial success. It is believed that those who worship and honor Mami Wata may be granted her favors and protection. In Slavic folklore, the Slavic version of mermaids are referred to as rusalki or mavkas and are believed to inhabit the rivers, lakes, and streams of Eastern Europe, captivating the imaginations of those who hear their tales. They are depicted as beautiful, alluring maidens with long, flowing hair and luminous, mesmerizing eyes. Similar to the Greek sirens, Slavic mermaids are often portrayed as vengeful and dangerous creatures, possessing an ethereal charm and ability to sing captivating melodies that lure unsuspecting travelers to their watery domain. It is said that they were once human women who met tragic ends, usually by drowning or committing suicide in bodies of water. As a result, they are believed to haunt these waterways, seeking vengeance on those who cross their path. They are known to be particularly dangerous to young men, often seducing them with their enchanting songs and then dragging them beneath the water to their doom. In the realms of Asian folklore, the Ningyo of Japan is unlike the typical Western depiction of a mermaid as a beautiful half-human, half-fish creature. Instead, the Ningyo has a more complex and grotesque appearance. The term Ningyo translates to human fish or merperson in Japanese. It is often described as a giant hybrid creature with the head and torso of a human and the tail of a fish. It has a monkey-like mouth with small teeth similar to a fish's, a full head of hair with horns protruding out, scaly arms with clawed hands, and possesses a flute-like voice. In Japanese folklore, the Ningyo is perceived as a harbinger of misfortune, associated with storms, epidemics, and calamities. Legends depict it as an elusive and valuable creature, sought after for its ability to grant immortality when consumed, along with its delicious taste. However, many tales
with
warn of
its
dire consequences for those who capture or harm a Ningyo, and bringing about calamities and misfortune. In more modern times, it is said that even Christopher Columbus, the renowned Italian explorer, encountered mermaids during his expeditions. According to Columbus's journal entries and letters, during his fourth and final expedition in 1503, he claimed to have seen mermaids while sailing near the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic. In his journal entry dated January 9, 1493, he describes seeing 3 mermaids. It is important to note that Columbus was a man of his time, influenced by the prevailing beliefs and folklore of the era. Mermaids were a popular subject in European mythology and were often depicted as enchanting half-women, half-fish creatures. Many sailors firmly believed in their existence, considering them both a sign of good luck and a potential threat. These beliefs were fueled by sailors' longing for adventure, their isolation at sea for prolonged periods, and their inclination to interpret unusual sights through the lens of folklore and superstition. However, it is widely speculated that the creatures Columbus encountered were not actually mermaids, but rather manatees, which are large, aquatic mammals inhabiting the coastal waters of the Caribbean. Manatees, with their plump bodies, blubbery appearance, and flipper-like arms, could easily be mistaken for mythical mermaids, particularly by weary sailors who had been at sea for extended periods. Columbus's misidentification of manatees as mermaids is not surprising when considering the limited knowledge and understanding of marine life during that era. The lack of accurate scientific documentation and the tendency to interpret unfamiliar sights through the lens of folklore contributed to such misconceptions. Beyond their status as creatures of myth and legend, mermaids bear profound symbolic meaning. They embody femininity, sensuality, and the untamed power of the ocean itself. Their allure represents an irresistible call to explore uncharted territories, evoking a deep sense of freedom and liberation from the constraints that bind us. Yet, they also serve as a warning, reminding us of the treacherous nature of the sea and the dangers lurking beneath its surface. But could mermaids be more than folklore? The field of cryptozoology has ignited debates and investigations into the existence of these mythical beings. Some claim to have personally witnessed mermaids, sharing alleged evidence and stories that push the boundaries of our knowledge. Nevertheless, it is crucial to note that scientific validation has yet to substantiate these claims, enveloping the existence of mermaids in an enduring shroud of mystery. Whether mermaids are myth or reality, they continue to inspire our imagination and deepen our appreciation for the ocean's wonders. Remember, our oceans are teeming with life, waiting to be explored and protected. Now, as the waves gracefully dance and the sun sets upon our expedition, may the legends and enchantment of mermaids forever remind us of the profound beauty and untamed mysteries that lie beneath the surface of our vast oceans. Please give a like if you enjoyed this video and make sure to subscribe. And as always, stay curious and stay brave. Until next time.
Oh, right.
Fairies, sometimes spelled fairies if you're into that, are part of a long tradition in mythology from cultures all over the world. They often represent an intermediary race, mystical creatures living in a supernatural existence, but parallel to us in many ways, somewhere between the realms of human and angels. Early incarnations were sometimes evil. The Egyptians thought of them as demons, while in ancient Greece and Rome, genii were spirits who brought ill omens when they revealed themselves to humans. But today we are going to focus mainly on the prolific and havoc-raising fairies throughout Ireland and United Kingdom. In J.S. Forsyth's seminal 1827 text, Demonologia, or Natural Knowledge Revealed, being an exposé of ancient and modern superstitions, he claims that there is a long lineage throughout all of Europe that contributed in some way to the concept of fairies. But the most direct origin might date back to mythology of the Old Norse gods, in which little beings, with the most delicate figures, lived in underground caves or in the crags of rocks, and were known for their wealth, which they were very good at accumulating because they did whatever it took to get what they wanted, even if it was evil. Fairy lore became so common, Forsyth describes, in most northern countries of Europe, there were few families that were without a shrewd or knavish sprite. Depending on how a family treated the fae in their life, lives could be made easier or much, much harder. For centuries, there's been a duality to fairies. They were evil when it suited human needs to explain bad luck, but if outcomes were favorable, the creatures were precious protectors. One proverbial blessing in England even said, "Grant that the sweet fairies may nightly put money in your shoes and sweep your house clean." Their lore was frequently manipulated to serve human intention. For example, in the case of witchcraft, communing with fairies was the same as communing with demons, a crime that could cause a witch to be burned at the stake. In other cases, if a woman reported seeing fairies, she might be diagnosed with hysteria, causing ecstatic illusions. The Irish Celtic
You're
Gaelic
just
traditions
hysterical.
of the Little People continue to be one of the most pervasive, celebrated, and long-lasting histories in fairy lore. Irish fairies were commonly called she. They were also sometimes referred to as fa'ri, which was thought to be derived from the Persian word piri, one of the earliest known examples of fairies. The Piri's influence on European folklore traces back to the Crusades of the 11th century. Christian holy wars fought in Palestine and the Middle East to usurp Islamic rule in the region. An intelligent, incredibly beautiful, and largely female mythical race, the Piri's actions were usually benevolent, but according to legend, the Piri's were trapped in their fairy form because of a sin they had committed. The price of their atonement was to have
Sinners.
neither a mortal soul nor immortal power. Similarly, by one theory, the Irish Sidhe were fallen angels. Like Lucifer, they had been cast from heaven due to their pride. This may also speak to the Christianization of pagan mythology, an evolutionary synthesis of the belief systems. Others believed that fairies were the spirits of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a mysterious early Irish race that was partially divine. The Sidhe lived in Tir na Og, a place where there was no disease, where everyone was perpetually young, and everything around them was created for joy and beauty. Death can only come to the Sidhe on Judgment Day. In their natural state, the Sidhe were similar to humans, but known for their preternatural beauty, with delicate, lithe bodies and corn-colored blonde hair that was so long it could touch the ground. They sometimes wore diaphanous robes of silver fabric. However, with their magic, the Sidhe had the power to take any form, conceal themselves completely, and could even make their own horses using scraps of straw. Their diet included milk and honey served in gold vessels, as well as the nectar of flowers they could drink directly from, like cups. There were said to be even more fairies than humans on Earth, and they were ruled by numerous chiefs, who distinguished themselves by wearing a ring of gold called a circlet around their head. Their homes were built underground, often beneath lakes, Norman ruins, or in the core of a hill. But inside they were deceptively luxurious palaces made out of diamonds, pearls, silver, and gold. The Sidhe hoarded their many treasures in their homes, some of which they took from shipwrecks, or from thieves who had to bury their loot. They didn't really need to steal wealth from humans, though. The gold and jewels that lived in the rocks all belonged to the fairies anyway. There was nearly always music and dancing in their palace halls, and under special circumstances, a human might be blessed with the opportunity to see them dancing on the hillsides. There were several ways a human might see the Sidhe, one of which was to walk 9 times around a fairy ring, which scholars believe are actually the ancient remains of circularly shaped settlements called Ra. After 9 times around the fairy ring, the human interloper may see the entrance and possibly even enter. But if they did, they might be trapped forever, either by eating the fairy food and wine, or by becoming so enamored by their beauty while watching them dance and sing, they go mad for a fairy kiss and can never leave. While some might be adventurous enough to
That's
go looking
not
for them,
good.
on the whole, the Irish dreaded the fairies' wrath so much they would not build on their land nor say fairies out loud for fear of angering them, instead referring to them as the good people or the little people. While the Sidhe had no religion, they did seem to fear some aspects of Catholicism. According to legend, when they fell from heaven, some were taken to hell by demons, where they gained the power to set evil spirits on humans. To this effect, they had powers over unbaptized children and could make them grow up to be evil or harbingers of bad luck. The fairies could send evil spirits in the form of beautiful women, charming men with their song and dance, to the point that they would commit heinous crimes for them. When their souls were black with the sins they had committed for the evil spirit, they would be taken to hell to serve and be tortured by the demons who lived there for eternity. Despite the beauty, youth, and luxurious leisure of their existence, the Sidhe were said to be inherently sad as well. They remembered that they had been cast from heaven and could never return. In this, humans had an advantage. Upon their death, they could go to heaven and live there for the rest of eternity. Belief in the Sidhe is so deeply ingrained and pervasive in Irish culture, it has been called a national and ethnic inheritance. West Ireland is considered a particularly superstitious region of the country, where Sidhe activity is high. Fairy lore became especially important in the early 1900s during the Celtic Revival, when their mythology became representative of Irish traditions being celebrated and reclaimed out of political necessity. William Butler Yeats was said to speak with Sidhe in his sleep, and Samuel Beckett, though known for being pragmatic, claimed he communed with a fairy in the front square of Trinity College. Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland, saw a strange horse run around a 7-acre field and change into a woman. England had many of the same influences in fairy culture. Early Norse mythology mirrored their own conceptions of malevolent dwarves, or Duergar, while the Peries led to more good-natured interpretations in British lore as well. Areas of Cornwall, Wales, the Isle of Man, and the Scottish Highlands all maintained rich Celtic traditions that seeped into lore around England. Scotland, in particular, had a rich history with Druids, who also lived in underground homes topped by large artificial mounds, which were inherently tied with fairies. Sometimes referred to as little folk, fairies found a home in classic English literature, such as Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and later in works by William Shakespeare, like A Midsummer's Night Dream. In Demonologia, J.S. Forsyth wrote of the contemporary conception of fairies in the 1800s at the time as people of small stature, gaily dressed in habiliments of green. They took great pleasure in sensual experiences, such as eating delicious foods and making intoxicating music. Outside of magic and mischief, they could take down an enemy with their fatal elf arrows. Sometimes they would disrupt the human world by taking a human and replacing it with one of their own kind, often when they were just babies. These unlucky souls were called changelings, and they had a reputation for dying young. At the time, they blamed this fairy-fated condition to explain certain mental or physical diseases or disabilities. There were also a wide range of fairies and their mystic counterparts by this point, including pixies, pygmies, sylphs, air spirits, salamanders, fire spirits, gnomes, goblins, earth spirits, undines, water spirits. These elemental spirits were thought to be everywhere, but their bodies were invisible. At the time, fairies were an accepted part of Christian mythology as well. Some believed fairies were the spirits of those who could not be placed in either heaven or hell, or that the souls of unbaptized children became fairies. One Protestant minister even theorized that, like Christ, fairies had the ability to become invisible, as Jesus had during the Ascension and Transfiguration. By the mid-1800s, belief in fairies was so common in England, it was not just superstition for rural communities or mystics. The lore was also accepted by artists, writers, scientists, historians, and theologians. The nation's obsession with the little folk hit a critical mass in the 1790s, with their portrayals in romantic art, featuring in fairy poetry by Coleridge, Keats, and Percy Shelley. At the time, there was a nostalgia building for the innocence and wildness of nature, including pastoral fae folklore, as the country was industrializing at a rapid rate. To this end, some even believed that the fairies were leaving England because of rapid urbanization, which was bad for the little folks' physical and mental wellness. Within the next few decades, fairies would become even more popular in the Victorian imagination and investigative spirit. Using new science, technology, and concepts from the Enlightenment, investigators attempted to prove or disprove the existence of fairies. They would study physical phenomena like elf shots and fairy bolts, which were later analyzed to be prehistoric flint shards and arrow tips, as well as fairy rings, thought to be created by the footsteps of fairies and later found to be caused by a fungus. They studied prehistoric monuments, like the standing stones at Rollright and Stonehenge, for clues of fairies or elves. Some creatively tried to use Darwin's theory of natural selection to prove that fairies were biological creatures that evolved on a separate branch than humans, imaginatively putting them along the same genealogical line as butterflies. There is even an enameled glass vase reportedly made by fairies, sitting in the Victoria and Albert Museum, built in 1852 and named for the Queen who defined the era. Many Fae investigators would join the Folklore Society, which was led by the prolific anthropological folklorist Edwin Sidney Hartland. Surprisingly, and yet unsurprisingly, there was a political motive to promote England's fairies. They had to compete with the popular fairy tales coming out of France and Germany at the time, including the much-admired Research of the Brothers Grimm. Perhaps it is not well known that the Brothers Grimm did, in fact, turn the quest to categorize fairies and other legendary characters into a science by bringing linguistic analysis, categorization, and systematization into their investigation. And because of the vastness of the British Empire, legends of fairies from indigenous peoples as far away as Australia and New Zealand eventually entered lore in the UK. For example, the Maori people had legends of the Patupare, who lived deep in the wilderness so as to avoid the sun, living in houses made of rolling mists. Some have also argued that legends of Maori fairies became colonized somewhere along the way, because the way these creatures look, with fair skin, reddish hair, and no tattoos, seemed rather close to a British imperialist. With fairies all over the world, we've barely scratched the surface of their history, so if there's any Fae mythology you want to see next, leave it in the comments.
dragon is nuts. Killed itself. beams full. It's just decorative. Not that we really need. Purely for decorative. That's part of building. Gotta make. Having no shit.
Hi, I'm Francesca Fleur, and you're watching Hammerson Peters. In this video, we're going to take a look at an ancient and unsettling legend, which appears in both Old and New World folklore.
For millennia, indigenous peoples all over Canada have told campfire stories about strange little men with magical abilities who lived in the mountains. The Inuit of the high Arctic, for example, spoke of shape-shifting elves from the islands of the Arctic archipelago. The Kaska of northern British Columbia, on the other hand, have tales of mountain-dwelling dwarves who could conjure powerful winds, and the interior Salish tribes of southern British Columbia spoke of tiny men who delighted in tricking humans with optical illusions.
Eerily, very similar traditions exist among certain Euro-Canadian settler societies. Just as European cultures differ from those of Canada's First Nations, the Little People of settler legend have certain Old World characteristics which distinguish them from their indigenous cousins. These differences hint at two hair-raising possibilities. that a belief in imaginary little people is some mysterious quality inherent to human beings, or that human beings aren't the only European immigrants to settle in Canada.
From the nymphs of ancient Greek mythology, through the elves and dwarves of Germanic legend, to the fairies of Celtic folklore, little people with preternatural abilities, who live in the wilderness and on the fringes of the civilized world, concealed from mortal eyes by some other dimensional veil from which they rarely emerge, have been staples of European folk tradition for millennia. To the modern mind, this element of European folklore is the quintessence of fiction, the story in which it is incorporated the epitomical tall tale. Fairy tales are imaginary stories we tell to children, or a designation we apply to narratives that are too preposterous to believe. Elves and dwarves populate our literary and cinematic fantasies. To our European ancestors, however, little people were very real neighbors, who could confer good luck if treated with respect, and wreak terrible mischief if provoked. Little people stories are not unique to the Old World. For centuries, European immigrants to Canada have reported strange experiences on their homesteads and in the wilderness beyond their farmhouses, which mirror the little people tales of their homeland. Folklorists attribute these reports to the importation of little people groups into Canada, contending that the settlers who
That
discovered
makes
them
it
drew
look
upon the folklore
much
of their
wider.
ancestors, in an effort to interpret bizarre phenomena
Much
for which
better
no rational
looking.
explanations readily presented themselves.
Have to
Many Euro-Canadian pioneers, on the other hand, unhesitatingly attributed the strange events from which such reports derived to the machinations of little people, firmly maintaining that their mysterious, diminutive, old-world neighbors had followed or accompanied them
crack a
across the
pop.
Atlantic and taken up residence outside their own settlements. The first written records of little people in Canada are arguably the Greenlanders saga and the saga of Eric the Red, medieval texts describing 10th century Icelandic Greenlandic Viking voyages to Canada's Atlantic northeast, known collectively as the Icelandic sagas. Both of these texts describe Norse encounters with diminutive, fur-clad natives, whom the Vikings called Skrælingjar, with whom the explorers traded and battled. Although many historians argue that the Skrælingjar were likely the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, the more ancient Dorset people whom the Thule displaced, or perhaps the ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq First Nations, some of the abilities and behaviors with which the sagas ascribed them were distinctly inhuman. Specifically, in the saga of Eric the Red, a party of Norse explorers attempted to capture a family of Skrælingjar they came across on their return journey to Greenland. Although they managed to capture 2 children, a Skraeling man and 2 women escaped them by disappearing down holes in the earth. The Skraeling children, after learning the Norse language, later explained that their people did not live in houses, but rather dwelled in caves or holes in the ground, much like the dwarves of medieval Germanic legend. Another dwarf-like creature which made its appearance in the sagas was the One-Footer, a stunted, one-legged monster which hopped from place to place, referenced in the writings of the classical Greeks and Romans. According to the saga of Eric the Red, the Norsemen who captured the Skraeling children were attacked by a One-Footer shortly after the kidnapping operation. The creature shot their leader in the lower abdomen with an arrow but failed to kill him, and hopped away before any of the Vikings could exact vengeance. In the 1870s, nearly 900 years after the Viking voyages described in the sagas, Iceland was rocked by a series of devastating volcanic eruptions, droughts, and ovine epidemics, which rendered the island country all but inhospitable. Encouraged by agents of the Allen Shipping Line, a Scots-Canadian steamship company which had recently opened an office in Reykjavik, thousands of Icelanders fled the land of fire and ice and immigrated to the Great White North, following in the shadowy wake of the longships that their Dark Age ancestors sailed to the New World. Prompted by generous land grants arranged at the behest of Lord Dufferin, the Governor-General of Canada, many Icelandic Canadians gradually gravitated to a stretch of Manitoban prairie on the southwestern shores of Lake Winnipeg, which would come to be known as New Iceland. Ever since, Manitoba has boasted the highest population of ethnic Icelanders outside Iceland. In the summers of 1966, 1967, and 1969, an Icelandic-Canadian folklorist named Magnus Einarsson traveled throughout New Iceland and the rest of Western Canada for the purpose of collecting Icelandic-Canadian folklore.
Throughout the course of his travels, he sat down with 98 Icelandic Canadian old-timers and recorded all the local stories and traditions they wished to share with him. Einarsson made 462 recordings, which wound up in the archives of the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. In 1991, Einarsson transcribed 175 of his recordings and published them under the title Icelandic Canadian Oral Narratives. Magnus Einarsson's collection of Icelandic Canadian folktales reveals a strong belief in ghosts, second sight, the power of dreams, and the supernatural among the mid-20th century Icelandic Canadians of south-central Manitoba. What I eventually found in the way of stories came as a surprise to me, Einarsson wrote of his findings in an introduction to his book. I did not expect to find people to tell me fairy tales or tall tales. I most certainly did not expect to find so many good, humorous anecdotes, and I didn't expect to find alive such a keen and pervasive interest in dreams and ghostly visions. Amid tales of hauntings and premonitions, Einarsson's book contains a handful of anecdotes pertaining to the Alvar, or Huldufolk, literally hidden people, elusive elves of Icelandic folklore who live inside rocks, atop cliffs, or within hills. The belief in elves has had a stubborn death in Iceland, Einarsson wrote in a footnote to one of his stories. The folklorist went on to explain that the Huldufolk are said to look, speak, and act like humans, but are believed to be of an essentially different nature. Contact with the Huldufolk, according to his informants, was a rare and potentially dangerous occurrence in the wilds of New Iceland. These mysterious entities sometimes attempted to kidnap human children and steal household objects. Huldufolk would occasionally approach humans and entreat them for help, and would confer luck or bestow particular skills upon their assistants as a reward for their kindness. Because elves are so bound up with a particular type of rocky topography, Einarsson wrote, there are not many reports of them being sighted in the New World, but the belief in them is, nevertheless, quite strong, especially among the older generation, unquote. He elaborated on the beliefs of the old-timers he interviewed in another footnote, writing, quote, in the New Iceland settlement of Manitoba, on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, there seems to be a greater readiness, at least among some of
This
the
is our
older people,
Dreamforge.
to see the
How we
environment in the
make
traditional way,
patchy.
as having a fourth, usually unseen dimension, than there is in some of the more recent settlements in Saskatchewan.
Like Anthony's Gundam. So proud
Four
of.
of the Huldufolk stories in Einarsson's book are set in Iceland, the birthplace of the respective storytellers. The first of these was told by Mrs. Sigurdis Thorsteinsson, an elderly farm wife who lived outside the town of Arborg, Manitoba. Mrs. Thorsteinsson heard the tale from an old man named Fusi, who would often tell her about, quote, all sorts of things that happened in Iceland, unquote. Fusi's father, Svein, had been a physician back in Iceland. One night many years ago, a strange man knocked on his door and asked him if he would help deliver a baby. Svein agreed. After gathering his coat, hat, and medical kit, the doctor stepped outside to find two
Hi,
horses
Looney.
tethered to his fence, one of which was apparently intended for him.
How you doing, buddy?
Before mounting, the stranger insisted that the doctor blindfold himself, assuring him that he would guide his horse to their destination. Mystified, Svein did as requested. They had traveled a long way, Mrs. Thorsteinsson said, and he said it had almost seemed to him as if they were going up the side of a mountain. And then, when they had gone quite a long way, he took the handkerchief from his eyes, unquote. Svein found himself at the mouth of a small cave, into which the mysterious guide ushered him. Inside, he found a woman in labor, whom he promptly assisted. Due to Svein's ministrations, the delivery was a success. Before dawn, the healthy newborn was sleeping soundly in the arms of his mother. When he was satisfied that his assistance was no longer required, the physician prepared to leave. As he rose from his seat, the new mother informed him that, quote,
Learn
he
about
would never
elves
fail in
and
helping a
stuff.
woman give birth
Right.
to a child, unquote.
Very
Svein returned home in the same manner in which he had arrived, blindfolded,
Canadian
his course guided by his
peoples.
mysterious supplicant. He went on to enjoy a long and distinguished medical career, and, just as the woman predicted, he never failed in his perinatal duties. The second Huldufolk story set in Iceland was related by Mrs. Sigrun Thorgrimsson, a housewife from Winnipeg, Manitoba. It revolves around Christian Christiansen, a member of a large family from Skagafjord, a region in northern Iceland characterized by a deep fjord and its valley, and the only county in the country where horses outnumber people. On the spring day, when Christian was 4 years old, he and his siblings were playing beneath a crag that overlooked the family farmhouse. And it was a peculiar crag, Mrs. Thorgrimson disclosed. They said it looked like a church. When the children finally returned home, it was discovered that Christian was not among them. A frantic search ensued, but no matter how thoroughly they looked, the family members could find neither hide nor hair of the missing child. And there was no hazard that they could imagine, Mrs. Thorgrimson said, neither Brooks nor anything that he could have fallen into. So they searched until evening, but the boy wasn't found, and everyone naturally was chilled by fear and sorrow, unquote. Christian's mother, Gudrun Sigurdardottir, tossed and turned all night. The family resumed their search at first light the following morning, scouring the fields for any sign of the missing boy. Their efforts were for naught.
Increase the size of our bridge.
Thin air. The rescue party finally retired to the farmhouse after sundown that night, the gathering gloom heralding the arrival of another dread-filled night. It was with a heavy heart that Gudrun set about preparing the evening meal for her weary family, now bafflingly short.
Yeah, we learned how to increase the size of our dragons.
Only to find little Christian standing.
So our little statues are now big statues.
Elated, Gudrun related the good news to her husband and children, who immediately crowded around the 4-year-old.
And we made our bridge much wider.
A woman took me, Christian explained, but I cried so much that she didn't want to keep me any longer, unquote. And that's all they ever got out of him, Mrs. Thorgrimson concluded. No one knows to this day where the child was during this time. Everyone, of course, thought that he had been with the elves in the crags, unquote.
Or Dragon Bridge.
Interestingly, the ideas implicit in this story accord with an old tradition of the Dene and Woodland Cree of northern Canada, which contends that a race of supernatural dwarves, with a penchant for kidnapping, inhabit the rocky crags along rivers. Another tale of attempted Huldufolk abduction in Iceland was told by Mr.
Oh, you know me.
A farmer from the village
Busy,
of Arborg,
busy,
Manitoba.
busy.
This tale,
Yes.
Mr. Bjarnason learned from his father,
Doing
takes place in
stupid
Iceland's
shit.
rugged northwestern corner. An incident occurred, Mr. Bjarnason began, in which a child, a girl, started complaining that there was a woman who came and wanted to take her away, but she didn't want to go with the woman, unquote. One day, while working outside, the girl's mother heard an alarming noise from the farmhouse and rushed inside to investigate. She found her daughter floating in mid-air at about shoulder height. As soon as she arrived, the child fell to the floor. At that moment, Mr. Bjarnason said, a gust of wind or some gust of air passes by her and seemed to disappear, unquote. Following the incident, the mother sought the services of a renowned clairvoyant named John. Although John was an elderly man who preferred to keep his journeys short, he agreed to travel to the farmhouse to investigate the matter. He arrived at the farm one evening and announced that he would begin his work the following morning. Unfortunately, the clairvoyant died in his sleep that very night, leaving the mystery unsolved.
He's dead.
The fourth and final Iceland-based Huldufolk story that Einarsson included in his book was related by Mr. Gunnar Alexander, a fisherman from Arborg, Manitoba. Mr. Alexander explained that, when he was 10 years old, he worked as a shepherd's assistant in eastern Iceland. One day, he headed out on an errand, taking a trail that wound along the slopes of a mountain. On the way, he spied 3 beautiful girls standing near a large rock some distance from the trail. I think to myself, Alexander said, that it would be nice to talk to them, and I turn off the path, unquote. In his haste to approach the strangers, Alexander tripped and fell to the ground. And when I looked up, he said, everything was in a fog. They were beautiful, boy, unquote. In addition to the stories above described, Einarsson included 5 fairy tales set in Manitoba, which demonstrate a belief, shared by certain Icelandic Canadian old-timers, that some Huldufolk had followed their ancestors to Canada. The first of these was related by Mr. Hallgrimur Staffeld from the community of Riverton, Manitoba. In a footnote, Einarsson explained that the incident described, quote, took place at the farm of Reinestad in northern New Iceland on Lake Winnipeg.
Canadian
On that,
encounters.
quote, there had been 2 or 3 similar incidents prior to this one, unquote. One day when he was a boy, Mr. Staffeld's son, Kjartan, was watching over the family's sheep flock when he was suddenly and unexpectedly approached by a woman who was dressed in a traditional Icelandic woman's costume. The woman beckoned for Kjartan to follow her, and the boy, in a daze, obeyed. They had gone about a half-mile toward the shores of Lake Winnipeg, Staffeldt said, when at last he sort of came to, wondering where he was going. Unquote. Startled, Kjartan looked around for the woman and discovered that he was alone. The boy returned home and relayed his adventure to his mother. Upon hearing Kjartan's description of the woman, Mrs. Staffeldt concluded that she must have been an elf, and that she had attempted to lure her son to the water. 3 Canadian Huldafolk tales in Einarsson's book involve the elves' alleged propensity to appropriate random household items for their own mysterious purposes. The first of these tales was told by Miss Margaret Bjarnason, the sister of the aforementioned Bjorn Bjarnason, who kept house for the latter. Einarsson interviewed the siblings together in their Arborg farmhouse in August 1967. Whenever Margaret did the laundry, she hung her and her brother's wet clothes on a clothesline outside. She maintained this practice even in winter, and would wear a pair of mittens when spreading out the laundry during the colder months of the year. I was going to hang out some socks, she said, and then I discovered that my gloves had disappeared, and it didn't matter where I looked, I couldn't find them. Unquote. Time passed, and Margaret forgot about the missing
Damn
mittens.
fairies.
A year later, she said, I find them lying in the clothespin box where I had always kept them, and naturally I had often opened this little box. The hidden people had returned them. Unquote. Miss Bjarnason never outright acknowledged a belief in elves, and confessed to Einarsson that she was unsure of whether or not they existed. She went on to suggest that most of the older people she knew definitely seemed to believe in them. After relating the tale of the missing mittens, Margaret Bjarnason prompted her brother to tell Einarsson about his own brush with the Huldafolk. Bjorn explained that, one day, he went down to the basement to tackle some household chore, which required the use of his knife. Once he completed the task, he searched for the leather sheath in which he always kept his knife, but was unable to find it anywhere. I made a determined effort to search in a bed that was there, he said, and all around it, and under it, and it was all for naught. And I went and got my sister, and we searched again where we could, although we had no idea where the thing might be. It wasn't found, so I said we shouldn't bother with it any more, that it was pointless. But a year later, or very close to it, I had some business down in the basement. Unquote. Bjorn went downstairs to work on this project, and found his knife's leather sheath lying atop the neatly made-up bed. Like his sister, Bjorn expressed an open-mindedness regarding the existence of the Huldafolk, but accepted them, quote, as a possibility in the framework of spiritualism, unquote, rather than in the, quote, framework of traditional belief, unquote. If you drive an hour north of the city of Winnipeg, along the western shores of Lake Winnipeg, you'll come to the town of Gimli, Manitoba. Dubbed the heart of New Iceland, this Icelandic Canadian enclave is the setting of what is undoubtedly the most famous Huldafolk tale in Canada, a modern-day saga which, like all good fairy tales, teeters on the border separating charming fantasy from unsettling credibility. The story revolves around Gimli's Town Hall, an enchanting 106-year-old building which was initially employed as a public schoolhouse. The window that sits directly above the building's main entrance is surmounted by a decorative arch composed of 3 large trapezoidal limestone bricks, the middle of which is missing. The conspicuous mortar-encrusted depression in which the stone was once set serves as a reminder of a seemingly unremarkable event which initiated Gimli's most famous fairy tale. One day in 1975, the above-mentioned stone unexpectedly fell from the school's exterior wall, nearly braining a female teacher who had been standing in the doorway. Many Gimli residents who still adhered to the traditions of their ancestors suspected that the close call might be attributable to the mischief of the Huldafolk, whom Icelandic folklore contends live inside rocks, such as those which adorned the school's entrance. Due to safety concerns, the local Evergreen School Division decided to close the school, unwilling to make the renovations necessary to bring the building up to code. As local legend would have it, the school board's refusal to renovate the edifice stemmed less from a preclusive budget than from a reluctance to
This
risk
will
offending the
create
little
an
people, a potential
wider.
consequence of such a project. In 1987, the new school council, apparently unencumbered by their predecessor's
Will I be
fear of
able to
hellish repercussions, decided to demolish the historic structure, prompting a coalition of townspeople to launch a campaign aimed at designating the abandoned school a municipal heritage site. demolition was delayed, and a series of unproductive council meetings ensued. In 1990, the crusade to save the school gained a new and powerful recruit. Dr. Leo Christiansen, the 58-year-old freshly retired president of the University of Saskatchewan, who had just attained membership in the Order of Canada for his academic services, was dismayed when he learned that his childhood school was scheduled for an indefinite appointment with the wrecking ball. Out of the blue, to the amusement of some and the astonishment of others, Christiansen publicly came forward with a fantastic personal story, which imbued the old building with a new aura of mystery and magic. The school was indeed inhabited by Huldefolk, Christiansen maintained, as many Gimli old-timers had long suspected. He knew this because two of the elves, named Snorri and Snæbjorn, had introduced themselves to him when he was a student
Snorri?
there. These Huldefolk had initially made their home on the second story of Tyrgerson's general store, the oldest of its kind still in operation in Manitoba, which was built in the heart of Gimli in 1899. When the store's second floor was removed in the 1920s, the little people took up residence in the attic of the newly constructed brick schoolhouse. Every once in a while, they would descend from their hideaway and play tricks on teachers and students, borrowing books, stationery, and other school equipment which struck their fancy. On crisp autumn mornings in the 1930s and 40s, when Christiansen attended the Gimli Public School, the elves would often sit at the attic window and watch young Leo walk over from his house across the street. The Huldefolk took a liking to Leo and decided to make themselves known to him one day. Over the next few years, the student would have several more encounters with the little people, who would sometimes answer his questions regarding their backstory. Snorri and Snæbjorn were pranksters, and Christiansen was certain it was they who had dislodged the stone from the school wall in 1975. In nearly any other Canadian community, Leo Christiansen's tale would have been received as nothing more than a playful attempt to inject some local color into a dry and flagging historic preservation campaign. In Gimli,
Aw,
Manitoba,
you
where a deep filial respect
worthless
for ancestral tradition courses
bucket.
through local veins, the story of Snorri and Snæbjorn met with both chuckles and tacit credulity.
I
True
don't
or
think
not,
the
Christiansen's
AI
tale
quite
gave new life to the
gets it.
campaign, helping secure much-needed government funding. As a complement to his marketing efforts, Gimli writer Kathy Hurlbert, Nee Arneson, and illustrator Jerry Johnson
I
dramatized his fairy tale in a children's book
certain
entitled The
things.
Story of the Gimli Huldefolk, in which Snorri and Snæbjorn are portrayed as large-eared, elf-like creatures with colorful scarves and tall, floppy hats. By 1994, a corps of volunteers under the auspices of the Gimli Municipal Heritage Committee were busy restoring the old schoolhouse. Led by Christiansen himself, who, despite suffering from Parkinson's disease, served as head of the building committee, the volunteers spent a collective 30,000 hours and $350,000 worth of government grants rebuilding the walls, rewiring the electrical system, replacing the furnace, installing new flooring, building a new staircase, and making cosmetic touch-ups inside the historic building. According to Christiansen, the renovation project awakened the dormant Snorri and Snæbjorn, who had enjoyed sole occupancy of the schoolhouse since its closing in 1975. They have great rapport with children, who are more likely to see them than adults, he said of the Huldefolk in an interview, adding that the elusive pranksters had recently stolen the boots he kept at the worksite. In an effort to appease the little people, he and the volunteers reserved the attic for their use, furnishing it with a tiny bed and other suitably small accessories. In 1996, the refurbished schoolhouse was converted into Gimli's multi-purpose community center. The municipality moved its administrative offices into the Heritage Building, turning half of the schoolhouse into an unorthodox town hall. Other vacant rooms were employed as social service offices, a museum, and an art gallery. The attic remained, and remains to this day, the domain of Snorri and Snæbjorn, in which local children are encouraged to leave drawings and written messages for their town's most elusive residents. To this day, there is no real consensus in Gimli as to whether Christiansen's tale was merely the product of his imagination, his enduring refusal to concede its fantastical nature being a manifestation of the droll, deadpan sarcasm which seems to characterize Scandinavian humor, or whether it had some kernel of truth at its core. Many, of course, dismissed Christiansen's story as a well-intentioned fib, and with good reason. There is some evidence suggesting that the former university president was a strong believer in the importance of stimulating childhood imagination, and that he was not beyond inventing tall tales in an effort to achieve that purpose. According to Manitoban creative communication student Josh Kerr, in an article he published on his website in December 2015, Lorna Tiergeson, the owner of Tiergeson's General Store, told him that Christensen, quote, said he was really sorry that he allowed Kathy Hurlbert to make images of Snorri and Snæbjorn in her book, strongly believing that every child should have their own
Pretty
imagination of
Frostbell.
little people, unquote. Another blogger who purports to be a Gimli native wrote the following on her website. One of my clearest memories from childhood is being at the bottom of a small spiraling staircase that leads to the high school attic, with my grandmother and Leo Christensen. Mr. Christensen let me feel a bump on his head, which he told me came from the brick the Huldafolk threw, unquote. Assuming that this memory is accurate, and that the brick to which the blogger referred is the famous piece of ornamental limestone which fell from the school in 1975, Christensen's disclosure to the author appears to be a
Andy
fabrication
Bland.
concocted for the youngster's benefit. Dr. Christensen was 43 years old when the aforementioned stone fell, living in the city of Saskatoon, where he was beginning his
so I
first
need
term as vice president
four-
of the University of Saskatchewan.
Or Frost.
Despite that the saga of Snorri and
find
Snæbjorn
four
seems to be little
Frost.
more than a product of Leo Christensen's imagination, some
Pretty
Gimli
sure I have
residents believe
30
to this day that their town, and the old schoolhouse in particular,
Frost.
is haunted by Huldafolk. According to 29-year-old Brittany Isfeld, a lifelong Gimli resident whom Josh Kerr interviewed for his aforementioned article, quote, the sound of giggling and footsteps as if they're running around, unquote, can sometimes be heard emanating from the old building's attic, invariably when the tape recorder is out of reach. Similarly, in Season 1, Episode 6 of the Canadian TV series Exhibit A, filmmakers Frank Wolf and Ted
Oh,
McHugh conducted a
I got
small
half
impromptu survey on the streets of Gimli.
We
in
need
which 38%
4
of participants
Frost Street.
expressed the belief that they share their town with the hidden
Another-
people of Icelandic Canadian legend. Another Canadian ethnocultural group with a traditional belief in little people are the Kashubian Canadians of the
another
Madawaska Highlands,
8.
the latter being a quiet rural area in southern Ontario east of Algonquin Provincial Park. Kashubia, the historic homeland of Kashubian Canadians, is a region in northwestern Poland which hugs the shores of the
12
Baltic Sea.
Frost.
Kashubians, the historic inhabitants of Kashubia, are descendants of a medieval Slavic tribe whose members were known as Pomeranians, who speak their own regional dialect and whose unique
People
traditional
known as
culture distinguishes them from their Polish
Pomeranians?
neighbors. In 1858, when Kashubia was part of the German Kingdom of Prussia, hundreds of poor, hard-working Kashubians left their homeland for Canada, hoping to build better lives for themselves and their families in the Great White North. Most of these immigrants settled along the Opeongo Line, a colonization road freshly blazed through the forests of the Madawaska Highlands, along which the British Canadian government was offering free land at the time.
Take
The
off, you
settlements where these
hosers.
immigrants founded, foremost among them being Wilno, Barry's Bay, and Round Lake Center, boast high populations of Kashubian Canadians to this very day. In 1968, a young Harvard-educated linguist named Jan Louis Prokopsky interviewed 15 elderly Kashubian Canadians from Wilno in an effort to investigate a rumor that certain residents of that quiet rural community harbored a traditional belief in vampires. He outlined his findings in a controversial paper entitled Vampires, Dwarves, and Witches Among the
Teleport.
Ontario Kashubians. Amid tales of vampires, witches, and succubae, Prokopsky's paper includes stories of supernatural dwarves, whom Kashub Canadians traditionally believed inhabited their barns, stables, and farmhouses. Dwarves are domestic daemons, Prokopsky began in his introduction to the subject.
How can I
These
have
positions
2
are not
forest
all bad.
base?
In habit and physique, they resemble human beings, except that they are very small. They wear red suits and red caps, unquote. The dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands were said to be
One of
mischievous
those is
entities
supposed
who
to be
sometimes perpetrated pranks on the farmers on whose properties they squatted. The most common of these was their practice of braiding horses' manes and tails at night, creating inextricable tangles which, in other traditions, have been called fairy locks and witches' knots. "Oh yes," said one of Prokopsky's informants in reference to this troublesome dwarfish courtesy, "about those dwarves. We were very much afraid of them. They told various stories about how the dwarf came, braided the horse. They so braided it that it was impossible to unbraid it. I still remember how our horses had it," unquote. "My father went to the stable," said another informant, recalling an incident from his childhood. "The horses' manes were tangled, and they said that the dwarves must have done it. "We were afraid to go to the stable." Unquote. Other manifestations of dwarfish
Need
activity
to go
were
to
circular
the
rings of
Tundra
dead
Base.
grass or scorched earth, which sometimes appear around farmhouses, which were said to be spots on which dwarves had danced. One of Berkovsky's interviewees remembered, quote, "seeing a circle as wide as a horseplow, in which nothing grew for over 5 years." Unquote. Another informant recalled seeing a similar ring outside her neighbor's granary. Although perhaps most strongly reminiscent of the infamous crop circles so often concomitant with UFO sightings, these circular patches of scorched earth also evoke a naturally occurring phenomenon called fairy rings. Circular patches in fields and meadows filled with or fringed by either dead grass, dark green grass, or mushrooms. Another sign that a farm had been visited by dwarves was a reduction in a cow's milk yield. Kashubian Canadian tradition contends that dwarves would sometimes milk their cows in the night. According to one of Berkovsky's informants, a Kashubian Canadian woman was once approached by a dwarf with a pail while she was in the process of milking her cow. The little fellow came from somewhere in the barn, the informant said, and asked her to give some of the milk for his sick child. Unquote. The interviewee neglected to disclose whether or not the milkmaid complied with the request. The most sinister trick in the dwarves' playbook, according to Berkovsky's informants, involved stealing a human infant and replacing it with one of their own malformed dwarf children. According to one old-timer whom Berkovsky interviewed, a dwarf had attempted to do this to an infant born to one of the first Kashubian Canadian families to settle in the Madawaska Valley. The kidnapper-to-be was caught in the act, and its plan was thwarted. Another dwarf, according to another informant, prevailed in its endeavors, successfully swapping its deformed baby with that of a local family while the child's mother was working in the field. It was evident that the child was changed, the informant said. In an effort to lure the tiny perpetrator back to her home so that she could force it to remedy its offense, the mother devised a trap involving a boot and a piece of meat. The mother successfully trapped the dwarf and gave it a thrashing, prompting it to repossess its own changeling and return the human child safe and sound. Although supposed evidences of dwarfish activity like fairy rings and fairy locks could potentially be attributable to natural phenomena, actual sightings of little people in the Madawaska Highlands are more difficult to explain away. One of Berkovsky's informants claimed that some people he knew had seen a group of small, red-clad people dancing in a circle by the riverside while they were fishing one Good Friday.
Down by a
Another interviewee
river.
claimed that, when she was a child, she peered through a small hole on a hollow log on which she sat and spied a tiny woman hiding therein. "I kept looking at her and was very much afraid," she said. "She had a hat and a nice dress, and wore shorts with buttons." Unquote. The informant called her mother over, but by the time she arrived, the little person had disappeared. Other interviewees claimed to have heard dwarves without seeing them. One claimed that mysterious sobbing, perhaps the lamentations of a dwarf, erupted from behind her kitchen stove.
That's
when
not-
the elder of her household announced the
That's
passing of
not,
a friend.
that's Tundra.
Another related a story that his uncle told him about dwarves who would emerge from a particular rock atop a treeless hill on certain Sunday nights to sing, dance, and play music on tiny violins.
And
They could hear
that
the dwarves, he said, but we were not able to see them. Unquote.
anyway,
The French-Canadian habitants who farmed their narrow seigneuries along the shores of the St. Lawrence River throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had their own little people legends, many elements of which they share in common with the dwarf lore of the Madawaska Highlands. The name that the French-Canadian farmers applied to their diminutive neighbors was lutin, a word which roughly translates to goblin. Two of the best sources on this
Goblin.
all but forgotten piece of French-Canadian folklore are 19th century writers Honoré Beaugrand and Louis-Honoré Frechette, radical French-Canadian nationalists and friends famous for their contes, or fictional stories, based on old French-Canadian folktales. Beaugrand wrote an academic-style discourse on the legend of the lutin in his article The Goblin Lore of French Canada, a chapter in his 1904 ethnology, New Studies of Canadian Folklore. Frechette, on the other hand, incorporated the legend into his French-language short story Les Lutins, or The Goblins, a tongue-in-cheek comedy which was published in the 1905 issue of the Almanach du People de la Laborie Bouchement. Similar to Washington Irving's famous short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in which the spectral headless horseman who confronts the protagonist in the climax is strongly implied to be the latter's human nemesis in disguise, the gullible narrator of Frechette's story encounters a lutin, who is implied to actually be an illusory projection of his own superstitions onto the antics of a mischievous coworker. According to Bougrand, quote, "It is evident that the goblin lore of Canada was imported from France," unquote, and that there are very few differences between Canadian Luton lore and its French progenitor, aside from, quote, "things connected with the
They're
difference in
French.
climatic
We
or
created
geographic
them.
surroundings," unquote. The word Luton itself, he argued, most probably derives from an ancient Saxon word meaning little, since, quote, "the most distinguishing characteristic of the Luton is its diminutive size," unquote. Frechette, perhaps indulging in a little literary license, elaborated on the creature's physical appearance in his short story, describing them as, quote, "little men, 18 inches tall, with nothing but a single eye in the middle of their foreheads, with noses like hazelnuts, a bullfrog's mouth split up to the ears,
Mini
arms
Cyclops.
like toad's feet, with bellies like tomatoes, and big pointed hats that make them look like spring mushrooms. The eye that they have in the middle of their foreheads glows like a burning coal, and that's what lights them up, because these folks sleep during the day and come out at night to cause mischief, you know," unquote. Luton attach themselves to particular households, on the grounds of which, according to Frechette, they abide, quote, "in the earth, behind stumps, between rocks, and especially in the stables, because if they have a penchant for anything, it's for horses," unquote. In the French-speaking parishes of the province of Quebec, Beaugrand wrote, "The Lutons are considered as mischievous, fun-loving little spirits," unquote, which either annoy or confer luck upon their inadvertent landlords, quote, "according to the treatment that they receive from the inmates of the house where they have chosen to dwell," unquote. In return for good treatment, Luton, quote, "will procure good weather for the crops, they will watch over favorite animals, and they will intercede for the recovery of the sick members of the household, attaching themselves to favorite children and guiding them safely through the infantine maladies of their tender years," unquote. If treated poorly by the residents of their chosen abodes, Luton will subject their human neighbors to, quote, "a long series of annoyances and persecutions of all kinds," unquote. These tricks include, but are not limited to, filling boots with peas or pebbles, sewing pant legs shut at the knees, mixing salt or pepper into tea, replacing food with stones, and tampering with tools. The Lutons of French Canada seem to take a special interest in horses. "When it comes to tending horses," Frechette wrote, "there are no stablemen to match them. When they take a liking to a horse, its manger is always full, and you wouldn't believe how its coat shines. Its mane and tail are as dainty as any dolled-up pet," unquote. Conversely, if a Luton is upset with a farmer, its delight is to take revenge on his favorite horse. Like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, the vengeful Luton will spend the night twisting the hair of a horse's mane and tail into hopeless tangles. Sometimes he will take the horse out for a long, hard nocturnal gallop through the wilderness, eventually returning the animal to its stall exhausted, lathered in sweat, and covered with burrs and thistles. According to Bougrand, there are two methods by which farmers can protect themselves from the wiles of the unhappy Luton. One is to pour a line of salt across the threshold of a home and the entrance to a stable, since, quote, "Luton have a holy horror for salt, and cannot pass where that condiment has been strewn in their way," unquote. If a Luton continues to commit its misdeeds despite this precaution, the only recourse is to kill and skin two cats, one of them pure black and the other pure white. Cut the skins into strips, and use the strips to create a lattice screen for the doors and windows of the building in which
Actually,
the pranks
kind of damage to got it.
And most enduring little people tradition in all of Canada is the fairy lore of Newfoundland. Imported to the Rock from Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and especially southeastern Ireland and southwestern England, this legacy of Celtic folklore bears many similarities to its Icelandic Canadian, Kashubian Canadian, and French Canadian cousins. Like the Luton of French Canada, for example, the fairies of Newfoundland were said to take farmers' horses for nightly rides and tamper with their manes and tails. Like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, they were believed to milk cows from time to time, and were said to be occasionally spotted dancing in circles hand in hand. Unlike these other Canadian traditions, however, in which little people were said to be inclined to attach themselves to farmhouses and rural settlements, Newfoundland fairy lore designates the wilderness the primary domain of the little people. Another characteristic which sets Newfoundland fairy lore apart
Here
from its
did the
Canadian
running
counterparts is the nature of the relationship which it contends exists between the little people and humans. The fairies of Newfoundland are said to be almost entirely malevolent, enjoying a purely parasitic association with the humans who trespass on their territory. Newfoundland settlers were so afraid of offending these little malicious entities, lest they make themselves the objects of their mischief, that they paradoxically referred to them, in the infrequent fireside conversations which their terror would allow, as the good people. One of the most authoritative sources on Newfoundland fairy lore is Californian folklorist Dr. Barbara Rietti's 1991 book, Strange Terrain, The Fairy World in Newfoundland. Rietti's book is essentially a curated selection of student-collected stories from the Memorial University of Newfoundland Folklore and Language Archive, or MUNFLA, supplemented by Rietti's own fieldwork and analysis. In her book, Rietti identifies a handful of alleged fairy hotspots, almost all of them located on the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland's southeastern corner. Many of these cluster along the shores of the predominantly English Protestant Conception Bay, which furrows Avalon's northern face, while many more dot Avalon's southerly Irish Catholic-heavy bays and harbors. Most of these hotspots are characterized by forest, marshland, berry patches, or sparsely vegetated barrens, all of these features being favorite fairy haunts, and are home to natural features with names like Fairy Ridge, Fairy Hill, and Fairy Marsh. Newfoundland fairies are said to delight in disorienting lone travelers who trespass on their territory, creating optical illusions which lead their victims off the beaten path and deeper into the wilderness. Their ultimate aim is to draw their human prey into their own other-dimensional realm, trapping them in the fairies, as Newfoundland vernacular terms the shadowy plane in which they dwell. In her book, Rietti includes a tale of a man from Bell Island, an alleged fairy hotspot situated at the southeastern end of Conception Bay, who claimed to have walked into one of these fairy traps while heading down a familiar trail through the forest. As he was crossing a path that he usually crossed, wrote the man's nephew, who recorded the story, quote, he saw trees that were never there before. The trees were about 50 or 60 feet high. He went down the road a ways and then went back again. He did this 3 times, and the third time he went back, everything was back to normal, unquote. Another man from Southern Shore, at the eastern end of the Avalon Peninsula, is said to have been walking on a well-beaten path through the forest outside the town of Vermoose, quote, when he sensed that he was walking on unfamiliar ground. All around him were high trees, the height of which he had never seen before. Then he began to curse and swear, and in the madness at having lost his way, took off his cap and flung it to the ground. Immediately, he was on the correct path again, unquote. A man named Roland O'Connor, who hailed from the town of Placentia on the Avalon Peninsula's western shore, claimed to have suffered a similar experience on October 1st, 1925. Roland spent that day hunting with his brother Ralph, but found little in the way of game.
He found a lava
he decided to head out for one last ramble that evening. Shortly after he left camp, his dog suddenly began to whine. His horse quickly followed suit, breaking into a nervous whinny without any apparent cause. At that moment, Roland spotted 2 black ducks in the underbrush, which he promptly shot. Thinking that the fowls must have somehow been the cause of his animal's mysterious agitation, the hunter made to retrieve the birds. Suddenly, a babble of unintelligible voices erupted all around him, muttering words he could not make out. Startled, he whirled around to find himself in an unfamiliar setting, surrounded by tall trees, cliffs, and large boulders. The bewildered hunter began to pick his way through the new terrain, wandering aimlessly without any familiar landmark to guide him. He continued his journey as darkness descended. When his tired legs would carry him no further, the hunter fired 13 shots with his rifle into the air, hoping that the sound would lead Ralph to his location. That accomplished, he sat down and waited for morning. At dawn, Roland found himself sitting on the familiar game trail on which he had set out the night before, a mere mile from camp. He reunited with his brother, who told him that he had spent half the night looking for him. He never heard any of Roland's gunshots despite their close proximity, and had fired 10 or 12 shots himself, none of which Roland perceived. Later on in her book, Rietti included a short monthly entry collected from a man from the community of Lumsden, on the northernmost lip of Bonavista Bay, the latter being a remote body of water north of the Avalon Peninsula. The informant claimed that his father had once disappeared while scouting out berry bushes. His friends searched for him for hours, and finally found him walking around in a circle, apparently in some kind of trance. When they shouted at him, he stopped in his tracks, immediately freed from the strange spell that had gripped him. As soon as he did, the informant said, he told his friends that he had been in fairyland, and he couldn't get out no matter how hard he tried. He said the fairies had been holding him captive. As soon as he came out of this trance, he recognized where he was and walked out with his friends. There are several methods by which travelers can protect themselves from being taken by the fairies. The most common of these is to carry a piece of bread in one's pocket. Instead of attempting to kidnap the human, the fairies will direct their efforts towards stealing the bread. Other protective measures include sprinkling oneself with holy water before going out, wearing clothing inside out, turning pockets inside out, and not wearing green-colored clothing, green being a color of special importance to the fairies. If a traveler actually sees a host of fairies in the wilderness, he can prevent the good people from doing mischief to him by tossing pieces of bread to them, making the sign of the cross, or praying on his knees. Legend has it that if someone is successfully captured by the fairies, the little people will offer him or her fairy food, which is said to be always devoid of salt. Those who eat this food will remain trapped among the fairies forever. Those who steadfastly refuse to eat fairy food may eventually be returned to civilization, although perhaps not in the same state as the one in which they had been prior to their capture. This facet of Newfoundland fairy lore eerily evokes the legend of the Buckwus, or Wild Man of the Woods, a supposed being of Kwakwaka'wakw tradition, said to haunt the forests and streams of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Legend has it that the Buckwus attempts to persuade humans to eat ghost food, which will transform them into beings like himself. Optical illusions aren't the only artifices which fairies employ in their efforts to capture human travelers. These mischievous beings are also said to physically drag people, especially children and teenagers, to fairyland by conjuring strong winds. If a strong wind picks up suddenly and unexpectedly on the island, many old Newfoundlanders will suspect it to be the work of the fairies. There are two methods by which humans can prevent themselves from being carried off by fairy winds. The first is to throw a rock or some other gift in the direction in which the wind is blowing. The second is to repeat the full name of the abductee to be backwards. For example, if a boy named John Smith is in the process of being blown away by a fairy wind, his abduction can be halted if he or someone near him repeats the words, Smith John, Smith John. One startling account of a fairy wind appears in the Munfla files, furnished by the subject's granddaughter. Her father and herself were picking flowers in a field back of their house on the southern shore, the story goes, when the little girl was picked up and swept across the meadow at a very fast pace. She wasn't touching the ground, but the heels of her feet brushed the daisies as she swept past. The father turned to see his youngest daughter taken away by the fairies, as he suspected, and yelled the girl's name backwards 3 times. Immediately the spell was broken, and the young child was placed on the ground without harm. Since that time, she has had special powers, predictability, an ability to read tea leaves, ESP, all unnatural, but stemming possibly from her being taken away that afternoon in the meadow, unquote. Not every Newfoundlander to have a brush with the fairies is as fortunate as the subjects of the aforementioned stories. Many disappear forever, never to be seen again. The fairies may leave some article of their clothing behind as a sign that they are with them in fairyland. Others are later found dead in the wilderness, often in places that have been previously scoured by search parties. Sometimes these corpses are found with prematurely white hair, hinting at the possibility that the victims suffered some terrible supernatural shock at the time of their deaths. Some of those believed to have been taken by fairies eventually return to civilization days, weeks, or months after their abductions. Almost invariably, these survivors return from fairyland inalterably changed in some way, usually for the worse. Most of these unfortunates suffer from extreme personality changes or mental disabilities. Abductees who are naturally talkative and outgoing may return taciturn and antisocial. Some develop speech impediments, while others lose the ability to speak entirely. Many are later committed to asylums. Nearly all either refuse to or are unable to describe their time among the fairies. In addition to mental maladies, some survivors return to civilization bearing deformities or suffering from crippling physical disabilities. Others look subtly, undefinably, yet undeniably different than their former selves. Many die prematurely, often a year or 2 after their return, bringing the secrets of fairyland with them to the grave. There is no consensus in Newfoundland as to the cause of the changes seen in fairy abductees. Many believe that the survivors return under the influence of some sinister fairy spell, administered for the purpose of preventing the abductee from revealing the fairy's secrets. Some suspect that the magic of the fairies is too powerful for mortals to sustainably endure. Those touched briefly by the fairies, like the girl who was nearly carried away by the wind, may develop uncanny fairy-like abilities, but those saturated in fairy magic will sustain permanent and irreversible damage. Others suspect returnees to be possessed by fairy spirits, while others still believe them to be fairies themselves, disguised in human form, aping the behavior of the humans they have decided to replace. Whatever the case, most variations of Newfoundland folklore agree that the changes affecting fairy abductees seem to visibly disappear at death. One of the most famous Newfoundland ferrymen, as returnees from fairyland are sometimes called, was Davy Mercer, a boy who disappeared one day on Bell Island in the 1920s. According to one informant whose account lies in the Munfla files, quote, "My grandfather told me of a fairy happening that he had seen himself. One day in the early 1920s, Poppy and his friends were playing near the woods. They were afraid to go in the woods because they had been warned of the fairies. Suddenly, they heard a giggling noise, one that sounded very unusual. Poppy and his friends ran as fast as they could to the nearest house. When they got there, they realized that one of the boys was missing. They were afraid to go back and look for him. Instead, they went to the Mercer home and told Davy's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer gathered up a few more older folks and began to look for Davy. They had no luck in finding him. It was a week or so when he found his own way home. His parents were shocked. Their darling little boy, who was completely normal before, was now practically deformed. They pulled sticks, rocks, and things from the lumps in their son's skin. Davy was now mentally and physically disturbed. From that time onward, he was never the same. As he grew older, he became stranger. He walked around crippled, wearing a long coat and a top hat. He always carried a briefcase and tried to sell things. However, no one ever saw what was inside the briefcase. Another Munfla informant elaborated on the case of Davy Mercer, writing, quote, "I still persisted to question my father as a non-believer of fairies. He next told me about a man who I personally had known. He was a Mr. David Mercer, who had lived on Bell Island. He was a short, thin man. He walked with a limp. His face was very white and wrinkled. His speech was not a stutter or a stammer, but a mixture of the two. And he had a perpetual grin, which was horrifying. He was a very awkward and even frightening individual. To see this person would quickly lead one to believe that he had experienced
Iron Dagger
of some sort. His look of terror was painted on his face. Dad explained what happened to turn a perfectly normal man into such a horrible specimen," unquote. After relating the story of Mercer's abduction, which differs slightly from that furnished by the aforementioned informant, the writer claimed that Davy was, quote, "found curled up by a tree in a fit of terror. He was crying and mumbling, his clothes were torn, and he seemed to be in pain. Many of the people who were present when he was found believe it to be the work of the fairies," unquote. Another Munfla tale which Rieti includes in her book is that of Jack McCall, a farmer from the village of Colliers, who was interviewed in 1989 at the age of 80. McCall recalled an incident which took place when he was a young man. He and his sister went out to collect tree branches when they found a local woman named Bride Hall raking a pile of hay into a cart. And all of a sudden, he said, this squall of wind come and rolled up the pooks together, took them all in one, unquote. Incredibly, Bride Hall flew away with the hay. Jack and his sister ran home and informed their mother of the incident. Although their mother was skeptical, she and her sister, Mary, headed down to the field to investigate. Sure enough, Bride Hall was nowhere to be found. A thorough search ensued, but without avail. It was as if Bride Hall had disappeared into thin air. 3 days later, the searchers found Bride Hall sitting beside a body of water called 3 Island Pond, casually knitting a pair of stockings. "So, where'd you get the needles?" McCall asked. "Where'd you get the wool to knit a stocking?" unquote. Bride Hall spent the next 7 years bedridden, and refused to tell a soul what had happened to her in the 3 days which succeeded her disappearance. Another disturbing tale of fairy abduction was told by an old man from Perry's Cove, located on the western edge of the Avalon Peninsula's northernmost finger, whose interviewer submitted the tale to the Munfla files. In 1932, when the informant was 16 years old, a little girl of about 9 years veered off the beaten path while tobogganing with some of her friends. Her sled carried her into a nearby marsh. Several men who were working in the area heard her frantic cries and hurried to help her, the informant said, although a short interval elapsed before she was reached. No amount of persuasion could coax her away, and finally physical force had to be employed while she kept crying out that she wanted to go back. They brought her to a priest, who blessed her, and tried to allay her hysteria, but she was never really the same afterwards. You couldn't get her to say anything, and she even had to be told to sit down, otherwise she would remain standing and staring vacantly before her. She was just a young woman when she died, only in her 30s, and in all that time she never got any better. Unquote. If Newfoundland fairies only played their tricks on those who encroached upon their privacy, people who hoped to avoid their pernicious attentions could do so simply by steering clear of bogs, barrens, forests, hills, berry patches, and other locales believed to be popular fairy haunts. Unfortunately, Newfoundland fairies are said to sometimes invade human abodes to torment their inmates.
Abodes.
Houses most commonly subjected to these unwanted intrusions
All
are those
abodes.
built on so-called fairy paths, thoroughfares which fairies follow when conducting their funerals. Legend has it that on certain foggy nights, especially on October 1st, October 31st, November 2nd, and May 1st, fairies can be seen marching solemnly in file along these fairy paths, carrying the coffins of their dead. Those who witness these funerary processions, who wish to preserve their sanity, are advised to avert their gaze, cover their ears, and inconspicuously leave the vicinity of the path. The best preventative measure people can take to avoid being harassed by fairies in their own homes is to leave some refreshments, specifically bread and water or milk, on the kitchen table or on the doorstep overnight. Fairies who enter the home at night will always avail themselves of this hospitality, leaving their involuntary hosts in peace. Another good practice is to refrain from whistling at night, as fairies are said to be attracted to nocturnal music. The most heinous crime committed by Newfoundland fairies involves stealing human infants from their cradles, usually when their mothers are not watching them, and replacing them with their own changelings. Grotesque, impish, baby-like beings that have faces like elderly men. These changelings rarely live long in their new environments, and when they die, their appearances revert back to those of the original children they replaced. There are several methods by which parents who find changelings in their babies' cribs can coerce the fairies to return their real children. The most effective of these is to thrust a shovel into the fire, wait until the blade is red hot, and approach the monstrous infant with the glowing implement. This prompts the changeling to abandon the cradle and flee out the nearest door or window, and the fairies to return the real baby. Parents unwilling to take this desperate measure can treat their infant's gruesome substitutes with extraordinary warmth and kindness. If the changeling receives sufficient affection, the fairies may return the original child out of gratitude. One elderly Newfoundland woman named Angela Mason told several changeling stories to an enterprising folklorist, who submitted her accounts to the Munfla archive. One of these, involving a family she knew personally, unfolds thus. Quote, "My mother, you know, she was from the Golds. The people who lived next door had a baby boy, and he was swapped. He was only a little baby, but he was starting to look just like an old man. The woman's brother used to live there with them too. He kept telling her the baby was swapped and wanted to redden the shovel to throw him out, but she wouldn't hear of it. One day she was in town and there was nobody home, only this brother and the baby. This was his chance. He reddened the shovel in the fireplace and brought it to the side of the crib. Just as he did, the baby flew right up out of the crib and out through the window, and he chasing it with a shovel. When he came back, the real baby was back in the crib." Unquote. The following is another Newfoundland changeling story collected by a folklorist named Wayne Lee Stephenville. Quote, "Alice Ryan was born a nice child, but at 2 or 3 weeks of age got cross and ugly, and showed behavior inconsistent with a child of that age. Mrs. Cook was an old woman who lived in Mussel Pond, a community some distance from Riverhead, and the acknowledged authority on supernatural events. 3 people from the community of Riverhead set out on the considerable journey cross-country to eventually arrive at Mrs. Cook's house with the baby, and find 3 cups of tea waiting for them. Mrs. Cook, when presented with the child, said, 'Give me that,' threw the child in the bedroom, put a shovel in the stove to heat, and invited her 3 visitors to sit down to tea. When tea was finished and the shovel was red hot, Mrs. Cook went into the bedroom, from which emerged loud cries and shrieking, and a noise such as the side was coming out of the house. Then, after a short period of quiet, Mrs. Cook emerged with a cute baby to announce that all was well. Unquote. Newfoundland tradition contends
That
that
was a
parents
good
can
one.
protect their infants from being swapped by the fairies by placing breadcrumbs in their cribs. Prospective fairy kidnappers who approach the crib will steal these morsels and leave the baby unharmed. Another effective precaution is to place the infant's crib away from the window, and to ensure that all the windows in the house remain shut. There is no universal consensus in Newfoundland as to the fairy's essential nature or physical appearance. One old Irish Newfoundlandic tradition contends that the fairies are angels who failed to take sides in the war in heaven, a celestial battle which, according to Christian tradition, was fought at the dawn of time, the combatants being the heavenly host loyal to God, captained by Saint Michael the Archangel, and the rebellious fallen angels, who pledged allegiance to Lucifer. As punishment for their infidelity, God banished the neutral angels to earth, to a twilight realm between heaven and hell, and promised them that they would be the last to enter paradise on Judgment Day. Legend has it that their assurance of an eventual place in heaven is the only thing preventing the fairies from venting their frustration upon the earth and wiping out its human inhabitants. According to Barbara Rietti, quote, "The fairies are protean beings, appearing here in one form, there another, sometimes changing right before a person's eyes." Unquote. Some Newfoundlanders who claim to have seen fairies describe them as tiny beings no taller than 1.5 feet. Most contend that they are the same size as children, while a few believe them to be as large as ordinary human adults. While some ascribe the fairies with youthful, childlike features, others maintain that their countenances are withered and ancient-looking. Alleged fairy witnesses have furnished many different descriptions of the clothing worn by the little people they encountered. Some fairies have been seen wearing green robes, while others were garbed entirely in gray. Some wore blue suits, while others affected green and red motley. A few are said to have been clad in lily-white raiment, evocative of certain Hulderfolk stories, while others were dressed all in red, like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands. Despite the many different descriptions of fairy attire, one remarkable consistency is a red stocking cap, which nearly every alleged fairy witness claimed adorned the crania of the little people into which they stumbled. It is tempting to dismiss the little people stories of New Iceland, the Madawaska Highlands, the St. Lawrence Valley, and the island of Newfoundland as mere remnants of Old World folklore, which European settlers imported into the continent, the product of our less sophisticated ancestors' attempt to make sense of the nuisances, tragedies, and bizarre phenomena for which they had no rational explanation. This comforting idea is challenged by the fact that many First Nations and Native American tribes have little people stories of their own, which bear remarkable similarities to their European counterparts. I touched on the northernmost of these legends in my video, Elves from the North Pole, which includes excerpts from my 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley. Conversely, my friend Mateo, whom you may remember from my video on the Wendigo of Pikes Peak, Colorado, just published an excellent video on similar native legends from the southwestern United States on his own YouTube channel, Modern Explorer, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.
Small blue crab? Oh, I grabbed this crab. Small blue crab. Crab. Oof. Yeah. Completely filled.
Well, Croppy, we certainly went and created one hell of a rod for our back here, didn't we?
An iron rod, you could say, a cold iron rod.
Yes, a cold iron rod for our backs, fittingly enough. Yeah, we probably should have thought for a few seconds before we decided to cover fairies. Probably the most ubiquitous being in all of world folklore ever in one single episode. That, not the brightest move in our book.
When have we ever thought for a few seconds?
Yeah, I mean, it would stop us from writing these exceptionally long scripts that, I don't know about you, I was up until midnight last night writing this, and I was up again at 6 in the morning to start again. So I'm looking forward to this recording being finished.
Only midnight.
So yeah, I can no longer do the days of being a student who inhales a vast quantity of black coffee and stays up all night to finish coursework, which is definitely what I didn't do because I was clearly good at time management. But yes. So today, folks, we have, I think it is our second Patreon voted topic for the podcast, which is fairies. The option I put on the list for patrons to vote on, which is a thing they can do, expecting that it would get the least votes, and we instead would be sat here talking about werewolves.
Yeah, we need to figure out how to rig these polls better to make our lives easier.
Yeah, I mean, I am technically allowed to vote in them on the back end, so I could start doing that, I guess. But enough people vote where that doesn't really make much difference now.
We do need to set up like a few hundred Twitter accounts.
Yeah, just like have a few dummy patron accounts that should tide it over. But yes, welcome to the show, by the way, which I forgot to introduce once again. This is, of course, the podcast Mythological, where we talk about all things folklore and legend. I'm, of course, Charles, King of the Fairies, and I am joined today by Coffee, Queen of the Fairies.
Does this title mean I get to live in an underground realm with no direct sunlight? Because right now I'm experiencing a Japanese summer, and that seems great.
I mean, that's basically how I spent the entire lead-up to recording this episode, was in a strange underground realm, which I may or may not have actually managed to escape from. I'm not 100% sure. But yes, I did actually spend an ungodly amount of time trying to find some sort of way of combining your name with the name of Queen Mab. But the best example I came up with was Queen Crab. So I thought, best leave it.
Yeah, maybe not, huh?
Yeah. So today, folks, we're going to be covering fairies in both their traditional and more modern guises. And I think we need to really start this episode by explaining what we have ultimately decided to do. Because, as I said before, fairies are a gigantic topic. I think there is basically something equivalent to a fairy in the mythologies of just about every inhabited continent, and most of the countries within those continents have their own individual and distinctive bodies of law. regarding some sort of unseen or mystical creature. So, trying to do all of this justice would be a bit of a fool's errand on our behalf. I think I explained it to someone recently as it would kind of be like trying to do something similar to what we did for the first couple of Dragons episodes that we did back at the start of this podcast, but maybe 4 or 5 times longer.
Yeah, I'd quit by then.
Yeah. So, what we've done instead is we have narrowed down the scope of this episode quite significantly. And what we're going to be doing today is discussing the history of the type of fairies with which we're most familiar, and that is the various fairy traditions of Britain and Ireland. Even then, however, we have had to be quite selective about what we want to cover. For example, I've written about 5,000 words alone on just some of the various types of fairy that are found in Ireland. So this will by no means be an exhaustive list or discussion. So with all that said, I'm going to make the mistake of asking here, Coffee, what was your previous experience with fairies prior to us recording this podcast?
My childhood and a lot of fantasy novels that I read. Basically, 30 years worth.
Yeah, basically, I don't think there is a single person in the UK, at least, who hasn't basically been exposed to fairies since they, like, before they were born, almost. It's just kind of a ubiquitous thing throughout your kind of fairy tales that you're taught in childhood.
Losing the name.
Yeah, there's no getting away from that, basically. So, yeah, bit of a silly question for me to ask in this particular occasion, but we usually ask it for the episode, so I thought it felt kind of right. So, with that obligatory question out of the way, Crofty, do you want to start by giving us a bit of a definition of kind of the image of at least what we would call the modern fairy with which we're all kind of familiar?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Because yes, the modern image is somewhat different. Much like when we talk about vampires, the modern image is somewhat different from what we might find in the folklore. But over the course of the episode, we will see hints of where modern ideas of fairies came from. So, depending on your exposure to modern fiction, your idea of fairies can probably generally be broken into one of 2 main archetypes. And so I'm going to use 2 famous examples to illustrate them, namely Tinkerbell and the aforementioned Queen Mab. So Tinkerbell is tiny, usually around 10 to 15 centimetres tall, and is most often seen as a small light zipping around the room too quickly to focus on. When she does hold
I
still,
thought Tinkerbell was a
closely,
sprite.
she's depicted as a pretty young woman with insect wings, which might look like a butterfly or like a dragonfly. The wings give off a glow, which lights up the space around her. That glow comes from the fairy dust, which covers her wings, which is the magical substance giving her the ability to fly, and which, if given to humans, such as Peter Pan, can also bestow the power of flight. From the Disney adaptations of Peter Pan onwards, her and similar fairies are generally portrayed as friendly, if sometimes a bit mischievous, and this image has inspired countless fairies in the media aimed at children. Some of these fairies get tasked with granting wishes, some tasked with protecting or being companions to children, and this sort of image is also the one that we associate with the Tooth Fairy, which I assume that's quite common outside of the UK and America, but as far as I know, I don't know how common it is throughout the rest of throughout Europe or other parts of the world.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that one, I must admit.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we grew up with and that I know is popular in America, but I haven't really confirmed elsewhere. So I will, for anyone who doesn't know, just in case, we'll say that the Tooth Fairy is generally taught to children that she will give them money in exchange for a lost tooth that's placed on the pillow at night.
Third of the way to our goal of 12
connected to a particular child.
prosper
For example,
pelts.
portrayed by the character of Navi and the Forest Fairies in The Legend of Zelda. But this benevolent image was not quite J.M. Barrie's original description in Peter Pan, though. It was somewhat sanitised by Disney. Barry describes fairies
Somewhat.
as being too small to contain more than one feeling at once, and so an angry fairy would become much more malevolent, such as, spoiler alert if you want to read Peter Pan, when Tinkerbell actually tried to murder Wendy. Yeah, I was not expecting that when I went and read Peter Pan for this.
Yeah, I'm going to say that that's something that Disney probably doesn't want out there that much, is that image of Tinkerbell, given that she's kind of one of the sort of mascot characters for Disney in many ways.
Yeah, Mickey Mouse might come after me to silence me for that one.
Yeah, you don't cross the mouse.
No.
Oh,
So, the
you
other
better take it
fairy
back.
archetype that's quite common now, which I'll use the figure of Queen Mab as an example of, are vastly different from Tinkerbell. Queen Mab is a figure that originated with William Shakespeare in a long speech in Romeo and Juliet, but modern fiction very much fleshed her out and gave her her own character. So I'm going to be using Queen Mab as portrayed in the Dresden Fight.
Get out of here, bear. I'm looking for boars, not bears. Boars.
So Queen Mab and similar fairies are often referred to as Fae, usually spelled F-A-E, and they appear as particularly beautiful but otherworldly humans. They are often divided into a very strict hierarchy, the Fae courts, which are ruled over by queens. For example, in Jim Butcher's works, Queen Mab is the Queen Court of Winter, or the Unseelie Court, and her opposite number is Queen Titania, who is also known from Shakespeare, who is the Queen of the Summer Court, or the Seelie Court. These types of Fae are bound by a number of strict rules in their interactions with the human world, which usually include an inability to lie and a compulsion to honour all agreements or deals that have been made with humans. While they have incredible magical power, they can only use it on humans who have already made a connection with the fairy world, such as making a trade, and so will often have a human intermediary. So, using the Mab example, she has the Winter Knight, who receives power from her in exchange for servitude. These types of fairies have an unfathomable agenda that's not necessarily good and not necessarily evil, but more sort of focused on their strict, fixed personalities and roles within their society, and to advance their agenda, they must lure humans into their service. Making a deal or making a promise to these fairies is always warned against, as they are masters of twisting words, saying things that are both completely true and completely misleading. To steal a joke from Terry Pratchett, like lawyers and philosophy professors. And an unwary character will often believe that they're getting what they need from a bargain, only to find that the fairy has held up their end of the deal according to the letter of the deal, but still left the character in need of more aid from them, and so keeping them trapped in a cycle of giving up more and more in exchange for help. We do see other variants less commonly outside these main two. A fairy court that's ruled by the Queen Mab type may contain other creatures as subordinates, such as pixies and sprites, which do resemble, physically at least, the Tinkerbell type, or we see small underground creatures such as gnomes, knockers or brownies, or creatures such as goblins, kelpies or selkies, and basically all kinds of other magical creatures you can think of do sometimes get grouped under the Fae umbrella. Some of them do have folkloric connections to fairies, or are grouped into the fairy folklore, which we will be seeing later in this episode.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in real quickly here and say there's also, this is kind of more common in the early modern period, and like the kind of Renaissance period, where the court kind of revolved more around the twin figures of a king and queen of the fairies, which I'll talk a little bit more in terms of its relevance within the literature of those periods.
Yep. And one of the famous fictional fairy that I will mention, just because it's from one of my favourite pieces of media, is the Great Fairies of the Fairy Fountains from The Legend of Zelda, who are quite different from most others in that they are water-dwelling fairies in a pond or a lake or a waterfall, who provide help to the player in the form of health upgrades or equipment, and we'll be seeing a bit more on them later. So the Tinkerbell archetype of fairies is not very common in folklore. It instead seemed to mostly emerge in Victorian Britain before being popularised in the early 20th century. By this time, belief in fairies was becoming viewed as quite a childish thing, to the point where Barry wrote into his world that whenever a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," a fairy dies, which will explain the hint that I gave at the end of our previous episode for anyone who didn't get it. The Queen Mab archetype is much closer to what we see in folklore, and while folklore often doesn't give explicit rules governing their behaviour as we see laid out in fiction, there are a lot of folkloric examples where we can see these kinds of rules and beliefs in action that did inspire this popular view of fairies. As I say, the other smaller types that do crop up in folklore, I believe Charles will be covering some more on later. So, prior to the 19th century, belief in these fairies was quite prevalent throughout society, with at least one documented case of royalty showing belief in fairies and having it affect certain policies that I'll be discussing later on. While scholars and writers of pretty much every generation would often claim that belief in fairies in their time wasn't as strong as in previous generations, these stories would still survive and be told quite widely among commoners and educated people alike.
Yeah, I think I have examples of people in the 13th century saying, "Oh yeah, it's not as strong as it was in previous generations." And then you can directly go to some guy in the 20th century saying the exact same thing.
Exactly. And with that, I will hand back to you, Charles.
Okay, so thank you, Crofty. So I think at this point, it's probably good for us to detail how we're going to kind of split up and organize the rest of this episode from this point onwards. What we've basically done is I will be covering the historical traditions and
Halfway there.
in both England and Ireland, whilst Crofty, you're going to be doing the same, but for Scotland and Wales. How I've actually structured my sections is that for the first half, I'm going to be giving a bit of a historical overview of how fairies and related creatures have been viewed in the respective countries I'm going to be talking about. And then I'm going to be using the rest of my sections to dive in and examine some of the more famous examples of fairies in both countries. Crofty, you did send me your notes in advance of this, so am I right in thinking yours is more the combined sections?
In the Scotland section, it does more focus on the history of it, because in Scotland there was a book written which defined a single type of fairy, and so I'll be working through the history of that. Wales, it will be a bit of a shorter section because we have a fairy that is quite unique to Wales, that is very distinct from just about every other type of fairy that I'll be going into quite a bit of detail on.
Okay. So, I think at this point we should mention our sources for today's episode.
That wolf just
So, I got
committed
quite a few here. What I'm going to do is
self-termination.
primary references and stories that I've taken from
Bonsai right off a cliff.
I'm going to mention those as I go and give you some details as where you can find them so that you can check out some more examples of fairies if you like. In terms of the kind of more formal academic works that I consulted, I used the monogram Elves in Anglo-Saxon England by Dr. Alric Hall. I used a long paper by Professor Ronald Hutton titled The Making of the Early Modern British Fairy Tradition. Those two works really form the backbone of the materials that I've used for my kind of discussion of history of fairies within England. I also used a bit of the introduction to Folklore and Nation in Britain and Ireland by Dr. Matthew Cheeseman and Dr. Karina Hart. Specifically, I used the sections that talked about the Brothers Grimm and their influence on European folklore as a whole. For some descriptive elements associated with fairies, I used the works An Encyclopedia of Fairies by Dr. Catherine Mary Briggs, along with a few small bits from her gigantic A Dictionary of British Folk Tales in the English Language, which I think runs to like 4 volumes. Alongside this, I also took a few bits from the Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology and Folklore by Professor Patricia Monaghan. That work I did have a few issues with. It's not very great when